Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Throne of Heaven in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 86, Foundations. When Ichigo came to, it took him a moment to realize where he was. The air around him was barely lit up, and he was laying on grey concrete that was dirty, cracked and looked somewhat askew, while a hot rain with the color and consistency of mud fell upon him unpleasantly, forming brown puddles around him while rivulets ran over his skin in a slimy, unpleasant sensation. The rain, even as different from what Ichigo was used to as it felt, was what helped Ichigo realize where he was, and indeed, as he slowly got himself to a seated position, he found that a small stone railing was behind him, and looking past the edge, there was water flowing around the base of the skyscraper he was staying on. This time, the water was black and churning maliciously, battering the surrounding buildings and breaking pieces from them with each wave, even as the waterline seemed to be climbing higher with each moment. With the knowledge that his mindscape was shaped by his own beliefs and that big changes to it were the result of something seriously affecting his soul, Ichigo wasn't sure what to think of the changes in the way it looked, other than it likely meant nothing good for him. Ichigo? Is that you? Zanjitsu's voice interrupted his train of thought before he could figure out the meaning of his surrounding, and Ichigo returned his attention to the Zanpakuto. The sword spirit had an expression of clear concern on his face, but there was also suspicion there, and while he was leaning forward to check on him, Ichigo also noticed that the old man was leaning on a black wooden cane, holding it with a strong enough grip he would be able to switch from using it for support to striking in a moment. Ichigo frowned, and asked, a bit of wariness entering his own voice at Zanjitsu's attitude. Who else should I be? I told you, I'm the real Ichigo, not him. The new voice sent a shiver down Ichigo's back, because he recognized it. It was his own. Yet it hadn't come from his own mouth, but from some distance away. He turned toward the source, to find a figure that looked like him, but only superficially. While it was wearing a Shinigami uniform, it was white rather than black, his hairs were silver instead of orange, and his face was chalk white, as if it had been bleached, at least the right side. The left side was covered by a very familiar half of a mask with red lines along the eye socket. And both of the eyes had black sclera and a glowing golden iris that sent a very different, much more familiar shiver down Ichigo's back. He instinctively tensed as he countered, in an angry tone. Why would Zanjitsu be fooled by this? You look nothing like me. So sure of that, are you? You mustn't have taken a good look at yourself recently. The copy, which Ichigo was pretty sure was Shiro, made a vague gesture at one of the many pools of muddy water that had formed on the various craters and cracks littering the rooftop. As he took that in, Ichigo realized that the cabin that had been the Hollow's hiding place was now a completely devastated ruin. He wondered what was it that had damaged his soul to such an extent as to be reflected in his mindscape in this manner, but then pushed the thought aside as he inched closer to the water, and then his breath stilled as he saw into it that his reflection looked identical to the face Shiro was sporting. How is this all possible? Why don't you tell us? You're the Hollow, after all. What is it you're trying to achieve with this? He glared at Shiro. Is there a point to this charade you're trying to put up? It's for my benefit. Ichigo turned towards Zanjitsu, and the old man elaborated. I can't tell which of the two of you is the real one, even to my senses, it feels like each of you is an almost even mix of both human and Hollow. He has been trying to convince me it's him the real Ichigo, and you the Hollow. In fact, he's been very insistent about it. That's because he's trying to take advantage of my weakness after losing that fight to take over, and this change is the result of his Ryutsu spreading throughout my soul and corrupting it. Shiro's words were spoken with a very confident tone, and Ichigo's annoyance at the Hollow's explaining his plan in such a backhanded manner was also tempered by a slight spike of fear, as he realized that, if he was trying to fool Zanjitsu, then Shiro had to believe he had a real chance of taking over this time. Which, combined with the fact the two of them now looked identically monstrous, might well be the case. Not wanting to let the Hollow set up the terms of the confrontation, Ichigo slowly got back to his feet as he asked, in a dark tone. Is that your plan then? Were you just biding your time since I lost the Hujioku until I was weak enough for you to make this move? Shiro didn't even answer Ichigo himself, instead turning to Zanjitsu and commenting. See? He's already trying to pretend I am the Hollow. Zanjitsu crossed his arms, saying, I remain unconvinced, before turning to Ichigo and adding, he has been trying to persuade me he's the real one while you were unconscious. I still have doubts, but that doesn't mean I'll just believe you are, either. I need some evidence before I take any side. Ichigo was left confused at that, because he wasn't sure what the old meant about taking a side, since even if he didn't believe he was the real one, that didn't seem like it would affect too much. However, he pushed the thought away, since the matter really shouldn't be that difficult to solve in any case. We don't need to waste time guessing, the truth will be obvious enough once we can sort of whatever it is that has us looking identical. That caused Zanjitsu to frown, while Shiro chuckled in a dark tone. See? I told you, that the first thing he would do would be to try and pretend nothing was wrong so he could take my place. It'll be harder to settle things now that he's on guard for it. The old man directed an equally annoyed frown at the Hollow, clearly in disagreement with whatever he was suggesting, but Ichigo had had enough of being treated like he wasn't present. What will be harder? While Shiro scoffed, the Zanpakuto spirit turned toward him and said, in a serious tone. He wanted me to kill you while you were unconscious, with the argument that you'd tired yourself out in this attempt to take him over, and that you would immediately try to get back to it by pretending that it was an effort to get things back to normal. That didn't convince me, however. That was certainly good news, in a sense, although the fact that he could have been killed, or would destroyed be the correct term, since it was his soul at stake, without even having a chance to defend himself sent a shiver down Ichigo's spine. He'd never considered that a possible risk, mostly because the Hollow had never attempted it before, and the idea that it could be wasn't at all reassuring. Still, he wasn't about to dwell on it, not when he needed to focus on the problem at hand. Which, incidentally, immediately raised a question in his mind. Why did he need your agreement? He could have done that himself, surely. There was a clear disappointment in Zanjitsu's eyes as he answered. Because I wouldn't have let him. And, if he's the real one, because he trusted me above his own instincts, which, if you're the real one, is also the reason you shouldn't have needed to ask the question you just did. That stung. Zanjitsu was right, he should have known to put his trust in him. His friends would always help him, even when it would be dangerous for them to do so. Not expecting his Zanpakuto spirit to do the same wasn't really fair, was it? For a moment, Ichigo wondered if perhaps something weirder than he'd expected was going on. He wouldn't have thought Shiro to simply stop when Zanjitsu insisted he should. The Hollow was arrogant enough that Ichigo would have expected him to take the sword spirit on and tried to destroy him anyway. Was there some truth to the Hollow's claim, were they both some sort of hybrid Ichigo-Shiro creature, with only a small portion of his real emotions? Or was his head simply being messed with in some way, so that he wasn't inclined to put the proper trust in people he should? While that seemed more likely, Ichigo wasn't sure how it would even be possible. After all, he knew, from his many talks with Shukuro when his friend had explained to him the functioning of his memory affecting Shikai, that this kind of messing with emotions was not really a workable thing, since every emotion was connected to a memory in a symbiotic relationship, and in fact, it was one of the weaknesses of his Shikai that Shukuro had explained to him, that his created memories didn't induce emotions into the target. The idea that Shiro might have stumbled onto something capable of breaking that rule when his powers didn't seem to have anything to do with it was very unlikely, and none of the other enemies he'd interacted with recently had shown any such powers either. Yes, it had been a fight to lead him to his current condition, but Ulquiorra's power was clearly something internal, not any ability to mess with people's minds or anything of the like. Thinking about the Espada, however, did bring something else to Ichigo's attention, and his eyes snapped to the inner Hollow. With the shock of the situation he was into, it wasn't something he'd considered immediately, but now that it came to mind, he realized it might just be what he needed to sort out if the entity that looked exactly like him was really some sort of clone, or actually Shiro attempting to keep up some sort of charade for reasons that were still unclear to Ichigo. So, Mercy Lago? What was that about? The copy flinched at the name, and Ichigo knew then that he was right. He was himself and the other one really was just his inner Hollow hiding behind this weird look, rather than something more esoteric. However, Shiro's reaction was extremely brief, and he controlled himself faster than Zanjitsu could check, the sword spirit having been focused on Ichigo until he spoke, so he was unaware of Shiro's bluff, as the Hollow folded his arms and said, scoffing. Right, like I would know. Why don't you tell me, instead? While apparently his Zanpakuto spirit hadn't noticed Shiro's reaction, the look of increasing doubt on Zanjitsu's face made it clear to Ichigo that, whatever mistrust he might have earned by failing to show proper trust to his sword partner, he had regained by pointing out that the best way to recognize the difference between himself and his inner hollow would be to interrogate them on stuff the other didn't know about. It was probably not enough yet, but Ichigo didn't even bother worrying about it. Seeing Shiro flinch had lessened Ichigo's fear of the hollow a little bit, enough for him to actually realize something he should have a long time ago, but which the hollow had always managed to misdirect him about. He'd been aware that his inner hollow had known the Grand Fisher fairly well for a while now, but Ichigo had not connected that to the fact to the most recent realization, after he showed up as an Espada, that Grand Fisher had to have been working for Aizen for a long time, not merely joined forces with him recently. After all, he had been part of the plot to retrieve the Hujioka from the Vizard and had brought Hiriko to them. Ichigo just hadn't connected the dots from that to the, in hindsight, obvious fact that, when Grand Fisher had called Shiro a traitor, it was Aizen's faction he was talking about him having betrayed. Which meant Shiro, himself, had to have known a lot more about their enemy for far longer than Ichigo had so far thought. He wondered, idly, if having forced Shiro to talk back when he had the Hujioka to do so, rather than accepting the Hollow's refusal to share what even then, at a time Ichigo didn't yet grasp the sheer size of it, had looked like a lot of information, could have made any difference, but he dismissed the notion immediately. Not only was the Hujioka only capable of controlling the Hollow's movements, with no power to access their thoughts, but trying to get such crucial information by force would almost certainly have resulted in the Hollow finding a way to mislead him that would have been more dangerous than a mere lack of knowledge. And, to be totally honest, Ichigo wasn't sure he'd have been comfortable doing it. He could just imagine Orium's disappointed frown if he'd suggested the idea. It didn't matter, anyway. Instead, having finally found something he could use to anchor himself, Ichigo took a determined step forward, ignoring Zanjitsu's hand tightening around his cane. His Zanpakuto wasn't going to hurt him, he could trust in that, and asked, attention fully focused on Shiro. You knew I would figure out the connection once I had a moment to think about it, is that it? Is that why you're taking the risk of trying to take me over now, when you never did before? Shiro's eyes filled with anger at the comment, in a way that would have scared Ichigo before, but which, now that he'd seen the inner hollow own fear of Ulquiorra, felt much less so, and much more like a weakness, as if the hollow was putting out a front to hide his own insecurities. And also gave Ichigo an absolute certainty that he was right. The hollow had been happy enough with not trying this, because he was scared Ichigo and Zanjitsu could get rid of him entirely if he gave them an opening, and it was desperation that was guiding his actions now. Although, when Shiro spoke, Ichigo had to revise his judgment. While the core idea was right, and the hollow was desperate, it wasn't just because he knew Ichigo would now figure how much he actually knew and require that he share those secrets. That was only one of his reasons. You think I don't see what you're trying to do? You need to hurry the takeover before whatever Ulquiorra did catches up with you, and you're trying to use this confusion to distract us while you do it. Zanjitsu, you must see that he's the fake one. It was also because, somehow, the attack they'd received had been far more effective at hurting Shiro than Ichigo had realized. But then, through the haze of memories of all the pain he'd been into at the time, he could vaguely remember that the Espada had said he was trying to get rid of his inner hollow, while at the time Ichigo had believed he to mean it in the sense of removing your ability to access it during this battle. It wasn't out of the question that, thanks to whatever knowledge Aizen had passed on about Vizard, Ulquiorra could have actually known how to remove an inner hollow from him completely. And that gave Ichigo pause, because, was there any reason not to let that happen? Obviously, since Ulquiorra was the one who had initiated it, Ichigo losing access to his inner hollow would benefit Aizen somehow. In fact, Ichigo could easily think of two ways it would: make sure Ichigo no longer had access to Shiro's powers, and ensuring what knowledge the hollow had remained secret. But, while thwarting Aizen's plan was probably as valid a motivation as any to oppose this result, on the other hand, he'd be free of the fear of the inner hollow taking him over. As much as he'd managed to make it work in his favor, Ichigo hadn't forgotten that this was the same creature who he'd first met trying to eat a child, and who had almost killed both him and Rukia when he'd been free to act without restraints. Having to share his soul and mind with something this dangerous and evil was not relaxing, and if he could get rid of it, shouldn't he? Not removing the hollow just because it might benefit his enemies a little bit wasn't really all that smart. He might need all the strength he could get to defeat them, but if he used his fear of them as a justification for taking actions that didn't sit well with him, wasn't that just another way of letting them win? It was, Ichigo had to admit, not the sort of question he'd have expected to ever have to face, and now that it was upon him without warning, he felt rather stupid for not having took the time to consider the matter before. However, that wasn't a reason to try to delay deciding it either. The problem was here now, and even if he wasn't ready for it, he had to solve it anyway, or he risked the worst outcome of all, for the hollow to manage to take over. Ichigo wasn't sure how that would affect him, but he was pretty sure it wouldn't be good. Or, was it? He realized, suddenly, that he really didn't know that. Sure, he knew his inner hollow was not nice by any stretch of the imagination, and he certainly wouldn't trust it to its own devices, but on the other hand, even if it got control of Ichigo's body, it wouldn't really be on its own, would it? That was the reason it was trying to persuade Zanjitsu to switch sides, after all, because, as long as the controlling soul had the support of the Zanpakuto, together they could suppress the control of the hollow. And, Ichigo realized suddenly, even if Shiro became the primary force of the body, he would not be able to do any real harm, since if the hollow tried, then Zanjitsu would realize who the real Ichigo was, and help him put a stop to it. It wasn't like the hollow could ever get rid of Zanjitsu, after all, since the sword spirit and Ichigo's soul were bound together. The only ways Ichigo could think of for that bond to break was if he let go of it himself, and unless he was destroyed, like the hollow wanted him to be, that wasn't about to happen. So, Ichigo raised his hands in a placating gesture, and said in a conciliatory tone. "All right then, if that's what you think, how about I accept to let you be in control?" That caused Shiro to go still in surprise, and Ichigo went on. "If you're the real one, then I can let you be in charge, control what we do, while I provide help and support as you need it, without being a bother. That should work fine, right?" While Shiro didn't seem to have an answer to that, Zanjitsu frowned and said, in a doubtful tone. "I am not so convinced that he's the real Ichigo that I'd agree to that. In fact, while I'm sure of neither of you, if I had to take a risk I'd bet on you to be the real one, rather than him." Ichigo smiled fondly at Zanjitsu, at how the sword, even in such a complicated circumstances, knew him well enough to have an instinctive sense he was himself, even if without any certainties. But he shook his head and explained calmly. "Don't you see? That's the point. I'm pretty sure I'm the real Ichigo as well, but since you can't be sure of that, why should we fight about it? Maybe I and he are both halves of Ichigo that got broken apart somehow. It's weird, but not the weirdest thing I've seen since getting involved in this spiritual stuff. It doesn't matter who's in control, if the other two of us are there to keep him in check, and wrestle the control away should the soul who's running things attempt to do something we disagree with. In that sense, it doesn't matter who the real Ichigo is, so long as two of us can agree that an action would be against what Ichigo would want, those two can stop the other from taking it easily, and stay true to the real Ichigo's will." He turned to watch Shiro, whose slaw-jacked expression of surprise was slowly turning into one of annoyance, and concluded, holding the hollow's gaze to let him know he was serious and his offer was genuine. "It seems like this way, each of us gets what they want, don't you agree?" Shiro almost growled back, before gritting his teeth and going on to say, in an angry tone. "No, because that's not what I want at all. I don't know what you're trying, but I know the only way to make sure you don't get to do it is by finally getting rid of you." He took a step forward, with a smirk appearing on his features as he went on to add, "And since you're willing to let me get control, I'll just get right to it." Ichigo immediately went into a defensive stance, before going on to say, in a warning tone. "Don't mistake my willingness to compromise for a willingness to surrender, they're two very different things. Letting you have a part of what you want in exchange for getting what I want is fine with me, but I'm not about to give up to you without a fight. And you won't be alone in that," said Zanjitsu, as he took a step to move to Ichigo's side, glaring at Shiro. The hollow turned an affronted glare on the Zanpakuto at that. "What, are you going to say that he's the real one just because I want to destroy him? You're a Zanpakuto, you're supposed to destroy hollows, not let them have what they want." Zanjitsu shook his head and answered, his tone hard. "No, that's not what betrayed your real nature. While Ichigo isn't the type to declare a person should be destroyed, I can see him doing it if he thought it was unavoidable, especially against an hollow. But in no event would Ichigo refuse the sort of compromise you were offered. What are you talking about? Not giving up and never surrendering is what got us through so many fight against very though enemies this far. Yes, but all of those fights were fought to help save and protect Ichigo's friends, and the people he cares about. To refuse a chance of saving them out of hand without a reason is not something he'd do. Oh yeah? What about Jinjo then? Why let him go? Zanjitsu was left confused at that, and Ichigo remembered that the Zanpakuto hadn't joined them yet at that time. Still, the answer to that was easy, so he told Shiro, in a calm tone. Because, while Jinjo promised to leave us alone, what he wanted to do would have caused a lot of damage to many people, and destruction of that scale is impossible to control. And he wouldn't have cared to control it. If you accept my offer, that's not a risk, because we'd be able to keep it under control. Compromise only works with people you believe will meet you halfway, and Jinjo would not have done that, whereas we've worked together long enough that I know you would. Shiro seemed surprised by that comment, as if he hadn't considered the obvious difference in the two situations. He wasn't sure why he wouldn't have, since it seemed pretty obvious to Ichigo. However, before the hollow could recover his bearings, Zanjitsu spoke up again, in a very serious tone. In any case, that's irrelevant. I'm sure now that you're the hollow, and Ichigo is here, so I'll be helping him put you in your place. The only thing left for you is to accept the situation. You can't win, but if you surrender now, you'll save yourself a beating. Shiro's expression hardened at that, and he said, his voice taking a rougher tone that, while something Ichigo thought he could technically do, felt very out of place on somebody wearing his own face. You might think that, but you forget one thing, even if you figured me out, the corruption that has been going on due to Ulquiorra's attack is still in effect, and unlike you two, I both know exactly what is the reason for it, and how to use it to my advantage. Then, the hollow suddenly darted forward with a push of Sonito, and at the same time, closed one of his fists and moved it in a swift motion toward his chest, which caused Ichigo's own body to suddenly move forward on its own, without any input on his part. He barely managed to call forth hardening Hakuta before Shiro's other hand smashed into him at Sonito speed like a missile, sending him flying off the rooftop and smashing into one of the surrounding skyscrapers that was somewhat taller than the one they were currently on. Ichigo coughed, and then went to move, but the hollow opened his hand, finger wide, and Ichigo felt his body suddenly go still, as if paralyzed, and started to fall in the water below. Thinking quickly, he used his Quincy powers to form a platform in midair under himself, slamming into it but stopping his fall. He regained control of his body as Shiro had to dodge a swipe from Zanjitsu, whose cane had turned into a replica of his sword form, and as he got back on his feet, Ichigo frowned, flexing his fingers to try and understand what was going on. He could feel his body responding, but there was something sluggish in the way it did, and with a bit more focus, he realized what it was. More Ryotsu was flowing throughout him than normal, and just like he had discovered when training for the fight against Byakuya, having too much of the stuff running through him made his body less responsive. It should also make him a bit stronger, faster and tougher, however, so Ichigo decided to test the theory by using full bring on the platform under his feet, turning it elastic so he could make a seriously high jump, and then use it again to send himself straight at Shiro. The hollow, after dodging the first few swipes, had turned around and was now putting pressure on Zanjitsu by using his superior speed to attack with many punches that the sword spirit was stopping and deflecting with his sword while grimacing at each hit, a clear sign the hollow was the stronger of the two. However, Shiro had to interrupt the attack and jump backwards to avoid Ichigo dive bombing him. Even like that, Ichigo still managed to land a punch that left the hollow reeling, a clear sign he could match him in strength. Ichigo went for a follow-up strike, but then the hollow looked at him, his golden eye glowing maliciously, and Ichigo's vision went hazy for a moment, which turned out to be just long enough to let his strike go wide, while opening him back to a brutal headbutt from the hollow that hit Ichigo in his solar plexus and slammed him straight into the ground, creating another crater with a number of cracks in a spiderweb pattern radiating from it. His head still shaking, Ichigo went to roll out of the way, but his body suddenly was seized by paralysis again, and he watched with dread as the hollow swung his fist down for a finishing blow, and was stopped by a thrust of Zanjitsu's sword, which deflected the attack, forced Shiro to jump backwards to avoid being skewered, and still left the hollow with a long, bleeding gash running all the length of his forearm, from elbow to wrist. Zanjitsu, while keeping his sword pointed threatening at the hollow, offered his other arm to Ichigo, helping him to his feet. The two then turned toward Shiro, who was watching the two of them warily, while holding his bleeding arm with the other one. However, after a moment, the hollow grinned, cruel expression that was made even more menacing by half his face being covered in his mask, and then, suddenly, in a glow of dark red light, the cut disappeared, and then Ichigo stumbled back as pain suddenly erupted on his arm, and when he glanced it, he saw that he was now sporting the same wound Shiro had been marred by before, while the hollow had straightened and said, "Smug. It seems like your numerical superiority isn't going to help you much, is it? How about you just let me eat you both and we put an end to this before I have to tear you apart piece by piece?" Neither Ichigo nor Zanjitsu dignified that with an answer. Instead, after exchanging a nod, the two of them went on the attack again, charging at Shiro from opposite sides. It wasn't as effective of a strategy as it could be, since they knew the hollow could use whatever was happening with his body to temporarily neutralize Ichigo, but that would take some of the enemy's focus, and Zanjitsu had proved that he could catch Shiro by surprise when he wasn't fully concentrating on keeping him at bay. Even if playing bait like this was risky, Ichigo was willing to trust that his sword spirit would be able to take advantage of the enemy's predictable tactic to capture him, since they had no assurance he couldn't shift a killing blow on Ichigo as well. Shiro didn't do what they expected him to, however, instead jumping back as he raised an hand with 5 marbles of black Ryotsu glowing red, one on each fingertips. Ichigo and Zanjitsu both managed to throw themselves to the ground before the Zero were even fired, and only after they were did Ichigo realize that they'd been aimed higher, the reason for which became clear when they all smashed into the closest skyscraper, the combined it opening a large gap across the building's entire front, causing it to collapse on the two of them a moment later in an avalanche of steel, glass, and plaster. The roiling mass of debris forced Ichigo and Zanjitsu to dodge in opposite direction, separating them, which had clearly been Shiro's intent in the first place. It seemed clear to Ichigo that the hollow didn't feel confident in going against Zanjitsu despite having proved himself stronger and faster in their latest clash, as he was already moving toward Ichigo, the one he had a mean to easily incapacitate. And he was clearly serious about wanting to win, because one of his hand, held wide at his side, was holding an orb of black Ryotsu glowing with red light, a slowly growing sphere of black Ryotsu, and Ichigo could already see the other was closing into a fist, clearly planning to paralyze Ichigo to let him open to the attack. Instinctively, Ichigo braced himself, ready to resist even if he knew it was useless, except that, the moment he did, he could feel his body responding. It felt like a vibration running all over his skin, and as Ichigo focused on it, it grew in intensity, as if readying itself alongside him. Then Shiro closed his fist, and Ichigo realized how the hollow had been stopping him. The hollow Ryotsu in his body, despite being empowering Ichigo and accessible to him for use, was still sourced from his hollow, and by exerting his will, Shiro was able to turn it from a roaring river of power running through Ichigo's vein into a heavy, stick sludge that clogged him and forced him to go still. Or it would have, if Ichigo's efforts to resist him hadn't made him aware of the other force. The moment he felt himself go still, he fought the feeling, and the vibration spread throughout his body, forcing the Ryotsu back into a liquid while making Ichigo's entire being glow with golden light for a moment, and he was able to use the hollow's speed to go into a roll that let him dodge the massive Zero Shiro fired, which proceeded to obliterate a large portion of the rooftop, causing a powerful tremor to shake it and send everybody on it tumbling to the ground. Having been in the middle of a roll, Ichigo was the first to sprung back to his feet, something he took advantage of to push himself at the inner hollow with a burst of Sonido. He could feel his muscles straining at the acceleration, but the hollow Ryotsu reinforced him enough to avoid serious damage. The maneuver allowed him to shoulder tackle an enemy in his chest just as he was getting up, pushing him back towards Zanjitsu, who was quick enough to raise his sword so that Shiro ended up impaled on it. The hollow growled, and then removed himself from the blade with a brutal backhand that forced Zanjitsu to dodge backwards, his blade sliding out of the wound as Shiro's feet had anchored themselves to the ground using what, to Ichigo's eyes, looked like Hakuta. Something the inner hollow had never been able to do before. In fact, even when Ichigo had given him the chance to control his body, it was generally Ichigo who had to put the focus into manifesting abilities tied to the Shinigami, Quincy, or Fullbringer abilities. Seeing the hollow pull it off so smoothly caused Ichigo to frown, as he considered why this might be. Unaware of the path Ichigo's thoughts were taking, Shiro glared at him, his eyes glowing, and Ichigo could feel the hollow Ryotsu inside of himself responding, as it started to shift in part in a manner that mimicked the wound the hollow had received, but Ichigo reached for the vibration under his skin, that will of stopping the hollow's interference, and the moment it did, the effect immediately stopped, and his torso glowed with golden light as he stared back at Shiro. After a moment, the hollow's eyes stopped glowing, and the wound he had received slowly closed itself as it was affected by his regeneration, without being passed to Ichigo as the hollow had clearly originally planned. Ichigo could see the sheer fury in Shiro's eyes at having been thwarted, but where in the past that had always left him shaken, this time, Ichigo could feel himself relaxing in response instead. He had finally understood what was going on, and so he raised his hands into a guard position, letting out a long breath as he got ready for his opponent's next attack. Shiro didn't make him wait, darting forward with his arms held wide, a marble of black Ryotsu on each fingertip so that he had Tensero charging at once. It almost sent a shiver down Ichigo's back to see that, because if he was hit, there was no way he would survive something like that, but he didn't let it hamper his focus, and just as Shiro reached him and brought his arms together to let the 10 beams fly, Ichigo focused his will, except this time, it focused on the hollow Ryotsu inside himself, and put all of his effort into ordering it to scatter. And, in response to his will, the 10 charged Zero vanished, their collected power scattered away before they could be fired, and in the moment of surprise as Shiro saw his planned attack neutralized, Ichigo struck, his forehead slamming into the hollow zone and sending him rolling backwards. Ichigo took a step forward, glaring down at the hollow, and explained. I get what's going on now, because of Ulquiorra's attack, you're breaking down, falling to pieces, and what's left of you is clinging to me, and has mixed with my soul, making it so we're sharing the same body. And since it's shared, we can both control it, you can affect me, but the sharing is mutual, so I can affect you as well. The hollow spat something that would have looked like blood, had it not been white, and answered, as he got back to his feet. So what if you figured that out? It doesn't change a thing, I still have control of a part of you, and I only need to successfully use it once to take you out. You might not be willing to surrender, but neither am I. I'll not be destroyed here. Just as he finished saying that, Shiro went to the attack again, and as he cocked his fist back, Ichigo felt his body seizing up, but he willed himself to resist, glowing with gold light as he did, and dodged while delivering a punch of his own, an exertion of his will forcing the hollow still so he was forced to take the full brunt of the attack and be sent flying by it. Ichigo slowly straightened as he said, in a serious tone. You're forgetting that, unlike you, I can stop the effect, considering last time, I'm willing to bet that's some healing effect my friends put on me. You can't beat me, because unlike you, I don't fight alone. As if to emphasize the point, Zanjitsu moved behind Shiro, his sword raised in a threatening manner. The hollow glared at them both, before saying to Ichigo, in a low, threatening tone. Even if your little band gave you some form of defense, there is one thing I'm sure they wouldn't have considered. Shinigami never give us hollow the proper respect, after all. If any of you ever bothered to try and understand us, instead of hunting us out for slaughter, you'd know there's more to us than hunger. And then, suddenly, it felt like Ichigo's blood was on fire inside of him. He collapsed, the pain so overwhelming that his muscles were twitching outside of his control in wild spasms, and calling on the protection with his will didn't do anything. It took him a moment to understand why, but when he did, fear gripped him again. The protection, whatever it was set up to stop the Ryotsu from infecting the rest of his body and taking it over, which was how Shiro had been paralyzing him, but what the hollow was doing right now was completely different. He was forcing his Ryotsu to self-destruct, by purifying minute particles within it and causing them to explode in devastating chain reactions all over, and each explosion he set up propagated through Ichigo's body, racking it with unbearable, unspeakable pain. Zanjitsu moved to stab Shiro, aiming straight for the mask, but the sword bounced back, and the hollow laughed as he somehow managed to speak, through gritted teeth. You can't purify me, without also purifying him, as well, unless you truly commit to take the mortal out. You can cause me pain, but not win. And as for you, mortal, if you won't let me win, I'll just take you down with me. I'll show you an hollow's pride. The pain intensified as soon as the hollow stopped speaking, while Zanjitsu glanced impotently between Ichigo and Shiro, clearly not knowing what to do to help. Ichigo closed his eyes, which the pain didn't seem to interfere with, and then tried to fight off the assault. The protection his friends had provided him seemed unable to help, but it did, at least, interpose itself between the self-destructing hollow Ryotsu and the rest of his soul. It didn't stop the pain, but it made it possible to at least sense what was going on. Ichigo grimaced again. The only way he could stop this was if he somehow managed to drain the hollow Ryotsu from within of him, as the thing felt like infected or poisoned blood, something he needed to purge from himself before he could recover. And, suddenly, Ichigo realized why Shiro had been so insistent on wanting to get Zanjitsu to not work against him, and tried to avoid fighting him, as he remembered a very traditional method to get rid of poisoned blood. He went to call for his sword spirit, but he felt his mouth being forced shut by Shiro's will, even as the eruptions of pain across his body intensified, but he called on the protection. With the pain, mustering the focus was hard, but Ichigo managed, by the simple expedient of focusing on only his mouth and throat, relinquishing control of the rest of him to Shiro. Zanjitsu. Leave him, and cut me instead. I need the help. The Zanpakuto was at his side in a moment, and despite the weirdness of the request, didn't hesitate to stab Ichigo near his leg. The moment he did, Ichigo forced the focus of his protection on the wound the sword spirit had opened at his side, and used it to slowly push the hollow Ryotsu out of it, even as he could feel Shiro's will opposing the effort. Initially, it seemed to work, but he'd barely managed to pull out a fraction of the hollow Ryotsu, that he started to feel resistance. Muttered, "It's trying to get back into the wound." From Zanjitsu told him what the problem was. Shiro's will was still within the Ryotsu, but once it was out of his body, Ichigo's own will couldn't direct it anymore. He realized with a grimace that, as things were right now, what he was attempting wouldn't work to completely free him of the infection. The more of the contaminated Ryotsu he pulled out, the more there would be outside trying to pour itself back in, and past a certain threshold, the difference in quantity was bound to make forcing all of it out impossible. He needed some way to keep the expelled Ryotsu from being able to go back into it, some form of barrier, or container, or... Before he could figure out something, suddenly and without warning, the pressure that was keeping him from pumping out more of the corrupted Ryotsu abated, and Ichigo realized that the Ryotsu that had been outside his body, trying to force its way back in, was now being drawn away, toward, he realized, the black sword that he had forgotten was at his side. He could feel it, as Getsuga Tensho absorbed the hollow Ryotsu the same way it would have normally absorbed loose Ryotsu in the air, and then kept it sealed within itself, sealing it away a little bit at a time, slowly but without pause. Ichigo could feel Shiro's influence on the Ryotsu itself loosening up slightly as a result of the surprise for such a development, and he seized the moment, drawing more and more of it out so that, by the time the hollow was back to put his whole will behind resisting it, Ichigo had done a lot of progress, enough that the pain that had been racking his body had already started abating. He wasn't sure how long it took, while he laid there on the ground, with the tip of Zanjitsu's blade into his wound to ensure that the regeneration didn't close it and Getsuga siphoning out the Ryotsu as he pushed it out of the body with the help of the power his friends had given him, and eventually, all of the pain was gone, and he could move again, if slowly, and proceeded to get back on his feet. While the pain was gone, Ichigo didn't feel like he was fully recovered. He knew it was likely a psychosomatic effect of no longer having the hollow Ryotsu running through his body to empower him, but he felt weak and slow, and strangely light, like a shell that had been emptied out. He could also feel the Ryotsu that had been drawn from his body, tightly sealed into Getsuga, and the sheer mass of it was frightening, like several gigantic springs coiled down and ready to snap at the slightest provocation. The effect was amplified by the sheer density at which the Ryotsu had been compressed to fit into the blade, but even without that, Ichigo couldn't deny that the sheer quantity was incredible. Only when facing the Espada or captains had he ever felt an higher concentration of power in a place, and in those cases, the power hadn't been just within reach of his hands. He shook his head, pushing the thought aside, as he started heading toward Shiro's collapsed form. His first step saw him stumble, but Zanjitsu was there to catch him, and once he straightened up, he managed to make his way to the hollow. On the way there, he passed one of the puddles of muddy water, and saw in his reflection that he had gone back to his normal look, with his uniform black, his skin back to his normal color, the half-mask gone, and his hairs back to orange. Shiro, too, looked different now, but unlike Ichigo, he didn't look like he had before, either. Although there was a resemblance, he looked like a ravaged version of himself. Most of his abdomen and everything on the left side that would have been connected to it was missing, portion of his black fur missing, while others were discolored from the normal black into a sick gray, or in some place sporting clear signs of burning, and his right arm was as mangled mess that looked like it had been pushed through a blender and was barely hanging on, with the obvious difference that the flesh and blood it was made of were various shades of gray and black, respectively. But the part that was most noticeably off was the mask. Ichigo was so used to hollows immediately disappearing when their mask was damaged, that the sight of Shiro with the left half of his mask completely missing, revealing nothing but a vortex of churning darkness underneath in which a globe of golden light sputtered and sparked as if on the edge of being snuffed out, was more upsetting than he'd expected. The other half of the mask was also damaged, with the normally massive, curved red horn snapped a few centimeters from the base and the red lines and white bone both marked by large black burn marks, which just contributed to making the whole sight make Ichigo's skin crawl. And yet, despite all that, seeing a creature that had once terrified him reduced to such a powerless state, Ichigo couldn't help a sense of pity growing in him. Cruel as he might have been, Shiro had been left broken like this because he had been fighting at Ichigo's side. He couldn't help but feel responsible for the Hollow's injuries, even knowing the Hollow himself would likely have mocked him for it. Luckily, Shiro wasn't privy to his thoughts, and with how empty he was feeling, Ichigo was having a very easy time concealing his emotions, so the Hollow had no way to know. As a result, there was only spite in those glowing golden eyes as the creature said, resentment filling his voice. "Looking at your handiwork, are you? Please, spare me the gloating and just get rid of me. I'd rather go quickly than suffer the pain of slowly eroding to nothing." A glance made Ichigo notice that Shiro was right. The tip of his mangled fingers were slowly dissolving, although, if the rate they were doing it was anything to go by, Ichigo would guess it'd take several hours before the Hollow was finally done for. Still, he cocked his head to the side and asked, genuinely curious. "Aren't you going to beg for me to save you, to look for some way to stop you from dissolving into nothing? Brag about your power, and warn me how I'd regret it if I just let you be destroyed." The Hollow scoffed, as if offended at the suggestion. "Right, like you'd spare me at this point, after I infected your body and tried to destroy you from within. Let's not kid ourselves, there are things that one cannot be forgiven for." Ichigo nodded to himself, getting the last confirmation of what he'd thought, before stating it out loud for Shiro benefit. "So, that's the last reason you tried so hard to take over now, because you expected that, since you'd already had to attach yourself to my body and infect it like that to survive, I would not forgive you for it, and so you might as well go all out with it. Is that it?" The Hollow's glare intensified at that, clearly annoyed with Ichigo's attempt to understand him. "What does that matter? It's over, you've won, you can finally be free of me, no longer need to worry about losing control of your body and fear that I'll hurt your friends and family when it happens." Ichigo let out a long breath, then sat himself down next to the Hollow, and said, looking at the sky, where the clouds were slowly changing color and the falling rain was starting to resemble clean water again rather than the muddy mess it had been before. "You know, even just a week ago, I would have taken that offer in a heartbeat, but, you see, something has changed since then. I don't fear you anymore." That caused the Hollow to growl. "Careful, I might be dissolving here, but I have still just enough power to fire a zero at you, and from this close, you'd be hard-pressed to avoid it. It wouldn't save me, but bringing you down with me would be a fair consolation prize." Ichigo looked down at the Hollow, then nodded amiably and said, in a friendly tone, "Why warn me then, instead of just trying to do it with the benefit of surprise?" He could see the surprise in the Hollow's eyes. It wasn't, Ichigo was pretty sure, that he hadn't thought of it, it was at Ichigo raising the question. It wasn't surprising, Ichigo knew that, due to his own fear of the Hollow, he'd always acted very carefully around Shiro, so he wouldn't be expecting such a brazen question. But seeing what it had taken for the Hollow to actually, truly make an earnest attempt at taking him over, instead of merely what Ichigo now recognized were half-hearted, careful attempts made so that the opportunity to back away from them was left open. Shiro didn't want to take over Ichigo for itself, he realized now, it was just a mean to regain his freedom, and ensure his own survival. In a sense, the situation was no different than what Sode no Shirayuki had been in. the Hollow had simply been far more aggressive in how he'd pursued the same objectives, and for his own part, Ichigo had left his own fear led him to treat the Hollow like a prisoner. The only time he'd been willing to treat him like a partner and offer the creature a deal had been when he'd had the safety of the power granted by the Hujioku to rein him in, but once the deal had struck, he'd had no need to resort to that insurance at all, and at his lowest moment, when Aizen had took the Hujioku back, Shiro hadn't tried to take over, despite that being perhaps the best chance the Hollow was ever going to have. That was why, right now, he was confident that Shiro would not try to destroy him, confident enough, in fact, that he raised a hand to stop Zanjitsu, who upon hearing the threat had readied his sword. The Zanpakuto looked at Ichigo with incredulity, but lowered his blade and took a step back, and after a moment, the similar incredulity that had appeared in Shiro's eyes disappeared, and the Hollow said, in a tired tone, "You're right, I guess. Destroying you wouldn't achieve anything other than giving me some fleeting satisfaction, and I'd rather leave you alive so you can be a pain in the ass for Aizen and Mercy Lago to deal with." Ichigo inclined his head and said, in a respectful tone, "Thank you." There was a long pause, and then Shiro spoke again, annoyance entering his voice. "Aren't you going to ask me what I know about them? Leverage my desire to get rid of them to collect the information that'll let you take care of it." Ichigo shrugged, glancing back at the Hollow. "Not really. I need you to understand that this isn't about me wanting something out of you, Shiro. I just have finally realized what you're about, what you called your hollow pride. If you want to offer help, I'll take it, but I don't want it to come with strings attached. I've been fighting Aizen and his minions without the information this far. It's clearly not so important that I can't do without. My power is, however, you'd have been killed by them multiple times without of it. Is that where this is going?" Ichigo sighed. There really was no real way to prove his honesty to Shiro. He could only act honestly toward him and hope that the genuine nature of the sentiment would shine through. "This isn't going anywhere, Shiro. In fact, let me cut to the chase, and maybe you'll understand." He unsheathed Getsuga from his side, causing the Hollow to tense, but he didn't use it to strike, instead slowly stabbing it in the stone between them, so that Shiro could see the black blade even from his position on the ground. It took a moment for his senses to register what he was seeing, but then Shiro inhaled sharply, understanding dawning in his glowing golden eyes, and Ichigo explained, slowly. "Getsuga works by collecting Ryotsu and storing it, and then release it as required. Just like an Arrancar Bala, which now I understand is also the way an Arrancar's mask works, just in reverse. And it has already absorbed the half of your Ryotsu that was inside of me. If you will it, you could seal yourself within it, which would ensure your survival." Shiro's golden eyes glowed with contempt, and Ichigo could already imagine the objection that was about to come, so he went on. "And no, I don't want this just so you can be my prisoner again. While Getsuga is connected to me, as an awakened item, it's also separate. I don't know much about Fullbringer powers, but Jinjo was able to creating a new one for himself. My father's own is made of item like threads and drugs that should be one shot, and that boy, Rukio, survived when his connection the item was severed. It's not something I can make you any promises about, but I don't think that it's impossible that the connection it has from me could be severed without damaging Getsuga, and the Arrancar show that, from there, creating a body for yourself is, at the very least, a possibility. I'm not proposing to save you just to enslave you again, I'm proposing it so that you could one day be free." Even if it wasn't reflected in his eyes, Ichigo would have been able to sense the Hollow's doubt from miles away, as he was doing nothing to conceal it. "And of course, all that I need to do in exchange for this offer is to accept to lend you my power and tell you all that I know about your enemies, right? That's the reason why you are willing to do this for me." Ichigo smiled, and shook his head again. "No. If anything, is the opposite. You said it yourself, I've relied on your power to make it this far, and wouldn't be here without it. And I understand, now, that I only achieved what I did by taking advantage of you, while offering nothing in return. I don't think that helping you in this manner is enough to balance the scales, but it's what I'm capable of doing right now, and so, I will. If you want, you can consider the fact that I won't ask you anything in exchange of this to be further repayment for your past help. If you accept this, but don't want to help me at all against Aizen afterwards, I'll understand, and just leave Getsuga behind when I head off to fight him." Ichigo got back on his feet, looking at the many towering skyscrapers that dotted his mindscape, then shrugged and added. Who knows, maybe my death in battle might be enough to free you. If that was the case, asking you to help would be counterproductive to the goal of helping you be free. Of course, I don't plan on dying, and I'd take any help to keep it from happening, but asking for yours when it might be detrimental to your survival doesn't seem very fair at all to me. There was a long, drawn-out moment of silence, but to Ichigo, it wasn't awkward. In a sense, it was almost relaxing. He'd reached a sense of peace with himself. In the past, he had already come to the conclusion that he should be achieving his victories without relying on Shiro, and that decision hadn't been wrong, but the reasons behind it had been, because he'd been thinking of himself first. But now, he was confident, he was approaching the problem from the right angle. His friends had always been the ones who had seen him through his every victory this far, with both their physical help, such as Zanjutsu helping him keep Shiro under control when the Hollow had acted up in the past, as well as with everything they'd taught him, such as Chad's lessons on Fullbring letting him develop Getsuga Tensho. And his greatest victory, defeating Byakuya, had come of the one time he'd been willing to treat Shiro as an ally. It was clear to him now that, if he wanted to win, all he needed to do was learn to truly rely on his friends, even if that meant some of the fight that waited ahead would be harder until he managed to really internalize the idea. I was recruited by Lost Noches about 2 centuries ago. Ichigo turned toward where Shiro's mangled form was laying on the ground, and observed him with puzzlement. The Hollow didn't seem to have reached for Getsuga yet, and instead was staring upwards at the sky. As Ulquiorra said, he was the one who scouted me out, alongside other Hollows. He was known as Mercy Lago, the Terror of the Night back then, a Vastolord with a bat-like shape who lived in a hidden cave whose location nobody knew, and hunted down Hollows who, according to him, didn't truly reflect their nature. Unlike other Vastolord, who stick to an area and thus could be avoided, it was impossible to predict where he would appear, but also unlike most other Hollows I know of, he would sometimes spare some Hollows, or hunt down specific ones even if they tried to evade him. He was a sort of horror story that Hollows told each other, and while he was very philosophical with those he spared about why he had done so, the reasons never seemed to make sense in any story I heard. My guess at the time was that he was just a madman who had come up with a code that made sense only to him to give a veneer of legitimacy to his actions inside his own head, and after meeting him in person, that opinion didn't change. There was a pause, then Shiro continued, his voice darker. It doesn't really matter much. By the time he tracked me down, he was working for his master, which was only called the Lord of Lost Noches, a Shinigami, we were told, who was looking for powerful Hollows to follow him, with a promise of greater power waiting ahead. And of course, the promise of death for those who didn't accept this generous offer. Shiro scoffed, then went on. I didn't learn his name until you met him, but the Lord of Lost Noches was Aizen. However, he looked somewhat different when I met him than when you did, not much, but you saw the difference yourself when he took the Hujioku from you, right? It's not just different makeup, but also the attitude, the way he stood, and even which emotions he let out. Plus, the one I'd met revealed himself as a master of illusions immediately, so I couldn't be sure he was the same person you met until much later. The Hollow shook his head, then went on, sounding defeated. Initially, it all seemed very simple. He paired some of us out, and sent us on mission in the mortal realm. We were deniable assets he could call upon to get rid of problems, or create situations he could take advantage of at later date. He's not infallible, some of those attempts lead to nothing, but others, such as our work here in your town, paid off. I had no idea at the time, but he used us to spark a war with the Quincy that exacerbated their traditional gripe with Shinigami to the hatred it is today. But that was the least of what he did. Ichigo frowned. He hadn't considered it, but if Grand Fisher had been working with Aizen for as long as Shiro said, then that meant the conflict that had led to his mother's death had to have been collateral damage from the man's plans. He clenched his fist at the idea, but then Shiro was continuing to speak, so he focused on that for the moment. What was far worse was that he started using us as test subjects for his experiment. That's how I know he created the Hujioku, because it was a member of the team I and Grand Fisher were also part of at the time. It was a Hollow with a very rare power of manipulating the body of other Hollows, which Aizen amplified, but instead of just stopping there, he also excised their personality, turning them into nothing more than an item, even when they had been among the most willing to work for him. For a time, it seemed like that would be all of it, but then, after the Hujiaka was stolen, the experiment grew in intensity, and he brought in a new hollow, a sadist named Zale, to help him turn more of us into tools and weapons. Many of those experiments failed, but that didn't stop him. Grand Fisher kept the truth of his power secret, knowing that if it was known, the potential of it being used to craft something similar to the Hujiaka would see him turned into experiment fodder, but my power was much more obviously something that could be made into a tool and not as easy to disguise, so when I realized what was going on, I escaped. There was a pause, as if Shiro were considering something, then the hollow went on to clarify. My power isn't actually simply to fire Zero more efficiently, that's just its only real combat application. What I actually do is exclude specific emotions from a certain portion of Ryotsu. When removing all of them at once, that creates a Zero, but I can remove only some, although all that does is shift slightly the consistence of my Ryotsu, making it more fluid or sluggish, having it react explosively with itself, or other things like that. None of which I can actually apply to anybody but myself, and not when shackled to you, since when you call on my power the Ryotsu is just surrounding you, and your soul underneath wouldn't benefit from the modifications. Ichigo didn't fail to notice that this explained how Shiro had been affecting him during this latest clash they'd had. It was evident that the hollow had known using the fullness of his power on Ichigo's body would just have hampered him, which was why he hadn't resorted to it in any of their past battle. Unaware of those thoughts, Shiro went on with his lecture. The big advantage is that, while other hollow need to crush their Ryotsu together and shed large quantities of it to achieve the purified Ryotsu of a Zero, I can just will it and it will be purified. It's always been my greatest advantage, but, to Aizen, I knew that would mean just making me into some weapon he'd carry about to have access to Zero at will, so I ran away, and since I knew he'd send Mercy Lago to hunt me down, I ran to the mortal realm, where the appearance of a Vastolord would have attracted attention, so he had to use Grand Fisher to go after me instead. He's powerful, but I know both his power and how he operates better than anybody else, so I was able to stay one step ahead of him. The half-mask that was all of the hollow's face folded in a grimace, and he went on. However, he still managed to push me to move in the direction he wanted. I didn't realize it at the time, but he likely didn't hone in on me because hunting the Visored was Aizen's priority, but he still made sure that, just as he herded them to Karakura, I was herded along as well. And then he deployed his final plan to get rid of me. Ichigo frowned, and then he remembered that Rukia had been hunting Shiro down when they'd first met. His eyes widened to reflect the surprise he was feeling, because he had no interest to hide it as he asked, shocked. You mean Aizen knew where you were, and sent Rukia against you on purpose? But, why Rukia? Why not rely on somebody else? Because he needed to test the Owlswool without revealing what it was for. Ichigo frowned. The Owlswool? I thought that was just meant to copy the connection of a Shinigami to a Zanpakuto, and that what happened to you was an accident. Shiro glared at him, and said, his voice taking a mocking tone. How daft can you be? Tell me, where did you got that information from? Ichigo grimaced. When he realized what Shiro was getting at, Aizen had been the ultimate source of every knowledge they had about the Owlswool. Having created it, everything they'd been told about it could be false, or at least misleading, if that suited Aizen's agenda. Seeing that he had grasped the point, Shiro continued, in a more neutral tone. The Owlswool was always meant to absorb spirits, both hollow and Zanpakuto, and keep them trapped and connected to the Quincy who had used it. That's why he corralled me to Karakura, because Grand Fisher had done a lot of work on priming the Quincy in this place for the type of response Aizen wanted out of them, and he wanted to give them a demonstration of the Owlswool's effectiveness on the field. If anything, the fact that Rukia stumbled upon you must have been a pretty big stumbling block in his plan, since you were completely unaffiliated to any other Quincy when you met her. Ichigo nodded, then frowned, and asked, letting a bit of the annoyance he was feeling into his voice. Why is it that only now you're telling me this? You could have told us as soon as Aizen lied to me about what the weapon was meant to do, or even told Rukia when she was hunting you down that she was being manipulated. Shiro scoffed. Right. Setting aside the fact that I had no idea that the Shinigami chasing me was unwittingly working for him at the time, are you seriously about to tell me that either of you two would have believed me, if I'd revealed this before Aizen's betrayal? Are you seriously about to argue you would have trusted the spooky monster over the friendly man who'd been nothing but helpful and, in your friend's case, a much respected authority figure? And by the time of the betrayal, this knowledge wouldn't have helped you any. I'm only telling you now because I wanted you to know everything I did. Which, now, you do. Ichigo let out a long breath, then nodded and said, trying to sound contrite even if what he was feeling was mostly tiredness. I guess. So, that's all you know then. I suppose it gives us a framework of sort on what Aizen is like, even if there's not much actionable. Thank you. Shiro looked at Ichigo with a disdainful glare, then motioned with his head toward Getsuga, the mere gesture causing the hollow to bleed, but as usual, he ignored the pain to say instead. Well, now that you know I don't have any useful knowledge to give you, aren't you going to take this back? Ichigo was left puzzled by Shiro's words, then sighed and answered. I don't know what I can do to persuade you, but this really wasn't about getting anything from you at all. The offer is for its own sake. I can't and won't force you to accept it, but if you want to continue existing, I will do all in my power to help you achieve your freedom. I'm not taking the sword back until you've finished dissolving, no matter what you'll do or say. Even if you don't want to accept now, you might change your mind later, and I, on the other hand, am not going to change my mind at all. The offer stands. There was a long pause, as the hollow's eyes glowed, as if searching something into Ichigo's own. He held Shiro's gaze without fear and hesitation, and eventually, the hollow must have found within whatever he was looking for, as he slowly nodded, and then inclined his head so that his broken horn touched the black blade next to it. Immediately, Shiro's form began to be absorbed into the Getsuga, at a pace much faster than when Ichigo had been purging himself from the hollow's Ryotsu. In just a few minutes, the form of the hollow had disappeared entirely. For a moment, a pall of quiet silence covered everything, and then, with a suddenness that sent Ichigo skidding back slightly, a surge of Ryotsu erupted from Getsuga, rushing forward like a black geyser before condensing in the massive form of his large hollow with black fur, a white mask with red lines, towering curved red horns, and glowing golden eyes. One thing, however, was different, as around the mask, a new mane had formed, resembling shoulder-length hairs much more than fur, colored in almost blinding electric orange. Shiro's figure stood still, looking taller to Ichigo than he remembered it, and one of its hands was staying on the handle of Getsuga. The hollow drew the blade from the ground with ease, and for a moment Ichigo, and Zanjitsu at his side, tensed, before the hollow's voice let out one of his familiar dark chuckles, yet, Ichigo could have sworn there was a note of satisfaction there that he'd never heard from Shiro before. The hollow turned toward him, and then said, his tone amused. It seems that the sword has a connection to me. Now, I can feel its call, and I can feel it'll respond to mine. And, as a demonstration, he threw the blade into the air, then extended his hand, and the sword disappeared from its place, reforming into his waiting fist. Ichigo blinked, and then asked with curiosity. Does that mean it already isn't connected to me anymore? Shiro shook his head, saying call it before letting go, and when Ichigo did, Getsuga reformed at his side, in its sheath, and Ichigo could feel that it belonged there. Whatever the new connection with Shiro was, it hadn't superseded his own, at least not yet. The hollow seemed to agree as it said, in the same tone. It seems we'll have to share. Ichigo shrugged and answered, relaxing slightly. We're already sharing a body, sharing a sword doesn't seem that much of a bother. How about I share something more then? Ichigo looked at the hollow in confusion, and Shiro scoffed, crossing his arms as he said. I might not know much of Aizen's plans, but I did met a lot of the hollows who were working for him, at least until I defected. If they all changed their names, like Eren Nero and Ulquiorra did, I might not be able to identify them, but the information could still be handy. Then, the hollow's eyes glowed with anger, but Ichigo could tell it wasn't aimed at him, as Shiro went on. The hollow that Aizen mutilated to make the Hujioka was as close to a friend as an hollow can get, and I've not forgotten he'd planned to inflict the same fate on me. So, if you'll accept it, I'll share my power with you as well, and this time, without reservations, or tricks, just working together. The hollow extended his hand toward him and concluded, in a tone that was half an offer and half a challenge, what do you say, Ichigo? He grinned back, clasping the hollow's hand and shaking it. With the corner of his eyes, he could see that Zanjitsu, while trying to maintain a stern composure, also had a small inkling of a proud smile on his face. Ichigo couldn't help but share in the sentiment, while they might not be there yet, with how much he had to learn from him and how much they were going to help each other. Ichigo would be willing to bet that he might be calling Shiro a friend by the end of this. And that, he was sure, was not something Aizen was going to have made plans for. Chapter 87, Restructuring. Shukuro Tsukishima stared at Ichigo's sleeping, recovering form with a certain annoyance. In a sense, he should have expected this. While Ulquiorra followed orders obediently and with confidence, he did tend to be a little violent in carrying them out, and sometimes too literal. They needed either Ichigo or Orium alive, so that they could be contacted by Tatsuki when the Visored were ready to move with their plan, and Ulquiorra had killed neither, but the standing orders of taking care of the renegade hollow that had taken residence inside Ichigo had not been rescinded, and so the fourth Espada had saw fit to solve that problem when the chance presented itself, risking to cause Ichigo's death in the process. If that happened, it wouldn't have been a big loss. They only needed one of the two, so Ichigo being destroyed would have been fine if Orium lived, and the opposite would have been true as well. It was, however, a risky move. If he'd been taking care of the issue, he'd have handled it very differently, but then, that was the whole reason he was checking now, to make sure no more trouble came up. It was undeniable that the Kurosaka boy had proved himself very determined in opposing Lord Aizen's plans. Of course, such opposition had been pitiful and easily removed, but enough of a reason to justify taking a direct interest in him, especially since they'd needed him to be tricked into carrying out a demonstration of the power he'd gained from the Auswol to their prospective local allies. However, that was now finally taken care with, and in the week Ichigo had been unconscious, the other Espada had finished the necessary preparation. With all the pieces now in their proper place, it was finally time to initialize the last step of Lord Aizen's plan. Which meant he didn't need to spend time undercover any longer, and could finally dispose of the trash on his way out. It was a shame, in Shukuro's opinion, that Ichigo wasn't conscious and awake for this. While the loss of his family should still be enough of an emotional gut punch to leave the Kurosaka boy in enough shock to not be a bother for a time, it would have been much more effective if he had Ichigo there, watching, as he slaughtered them all. Perhaps that was the reason he was here, Tsukishima mused to himself, to make one last check and see if Ichigo had woken up before he had to go ahead and kill his sisters and father. Sadly, that didn't seem to be the case. He moved closer, waving his hands as he did to run a diagnostic Kido, to try and get a sense for how long it would still take for him to wake up. After all, the boy had been moved from the Shinigami area to his father's clinic once they had determined that he was out of danger. If he hadn't been brought to this more accessible place, Shukuro wouldn't have dared risk visiting him. Since he'd only been moved once, his doctors were sure that his soul was stable and just needed to finish filtering out the hollow Ryotsu out, a process which for some reason seemed to be taking longer than it should have. Shukuro would have expected him to be just about ready to wake up by now. And in fact, as he placed his hand on Kurosaka's forehead and checked, he realized with a frown that, indeed, the boy was pretty much fine. It seemed, however, that for whatever reason, instead of hastening the process of moving the Ryotsu into the Auswol, which was acting as a filter, he wasn't exerting his will to push it into it at all, so that the filtering was proceeding at a snail's pace. Shukuro tried to imagine what reason the boy could possibly have not to rush the process out, which going from what he could see had been done to his body. He was pretty sure he could, even if he wasn't. The only explanation possible was that he was waiting for something, somehow. He'd just finished realizing this when, suddenly, even as he was watching, the process sped up. Indeed, it accelerated to a ridiculous degree, so fast that his diagnostic Kido had trouble tracking it. It seemed, Shukuro mused to himself, that this might have been the reason, that Kurosaki had somehow known that, if he didn't push it, the hollow Ryotsu would eventually rush out and let itself be transferred into the Auswol all at once. It was weird, but then, Shukuro was no expert on Visored. He'd just report the event to Lord Aizen and let his master draw his own conclusions. At least the fact had the advantage that he was going to be able to make Kurosaki a spectator to his family's destruction, which was going to be fun. He drew his sword, calling on his Shikai to once again mess with the boy's memories so that he would be seen by him as a friend, and that was when the door opened, to Shukuro's surprise, since he'd checked and Kurosaka's father had assured him nobody was going to be visiting. But then, as soon as he recognized the visitor, he understood that this hadn't been a planned thing, but rather a spur-of-the-moment one, as befitting the person in question, annoyingly. He really should have seen it coming, and blamed himself for the oversight. Orium Inu's expression went from relaxed to puzzled to wide-eyed disbelief in a fraction of a second. She really didn't seem to have any ability to control her emotions at all, which made the fact she was somehow still capable of spiritual fighting all the more annoying. She shouted, "Get away from him! Shun Shunrika, help!" As she pointed a flat hand toward him, 6 marbles of glowing golden light shooting at him with the motion, but he managed to put his sword in the way, reinforcing it to block the attack, and even still, they hit hard enough to send him skidding backwards. The projectiles retreated a bit, clearly rearing back for their next attack, but Shukuro immediately punched out with his free hand, the Kido erupting from his hand in the form of a dozen or so meteors, forcing the Fullbringer to wave her hands to create a wall. His attack was completely halted in its tracks, but the forced interruption in her attack was enough for him to use Shunpo and strike at Kurosaki. Inu shouted, "Leave Ichigo alone!" with genuine fury in her voice, and he was forced to dodge down to avoid what looked like an extremely deadly line of light that had flown straight where his chest would have been, but it didn't matter, because he'd managed to graze the boy's arm as he fell, and through the tiny cut, he was able to send the power of his Shikai into his mind. He created memories of friendship and trust with ease, having done it before many times, and then took advantage of the fact that the memories would create emotions into his target matching the experiences he'd faked into causing a sudden spike of adrenaline into Kurosaki. So, even as Shukuro hit the ground, the orange-haired boy sat up, blinking sleep out of his eyes in confusion before he focused on his friend. "Orium? Why is your power up?" The girl didn't lose any time to be surprised at Kurosaki waking up, instead pointing at Shukuro and saying, in a hurried tone, "Ichigo, behind you, it's Tsukishima. He's here to kill you." The boy blinked, glancing back at Shukuro with an apologetic expression on his face, before placing a hand over his forehead and sighing before saying, sounding tired, "Orium, this is not like you think." Internally, Shukuro couldn't help but be annoyed that the boy was so ready to betray his secret, even if it was all a lie. To Kurosaki it should have felt like the two of them were the best of friends. Being betrayed like this wasn't pleasant at all. Shukuro definitely preferred being on the other side of the experience. Still, he couldn't let him try to explain. He was doubtful his implanted memories would stand up to the scrutiny the girl would put them through, especially since he expected Kurosaki would do his best to be reasonable and listen with an open mind to keep the girl calm. That would risk the two of them turning on him, and while Shukuro was confident he could take the two teenagers, he was not confident he could do it before reinforcement showed up in enough numbers for him to be trapped. No, there was a perfect solution here, and as he thought of it, even as he kept his face impassive, he felt a certain glee at putting such a thing in motion. Before anybody could say anything else he spoke, hurriedly. "Ichigo, that's not Orium, that's Eren Nero. They've found out about me, and have come here to kill us. His allies are attacking your family as we speak." Kurosaki tensed at that, in surprise, and just as Shukuro had hoped, Orium shouted, angry and annoyed. "No, he's lying. Ichigo, you know he's been working for Aizen the whole time." Shukuro could see Ichigo wavering, so he put even more urgency in his tone as he said, "Your sisters are in danger, I need to go help Aizen." And he darted toward the wall. Orium moved to charge at him, shouting, "I'm not letting you get away, traitor." But then, in a blur of movement, Ichigo was between them, forcing the girl to abort her charge, as Ichigo said, frowning, "Your performance is slipping, Arrancar. Orium wouldn't try to kill one of my former friends like that, no matter how much she believed he had betrayed us." Shukuro saw the confusion on the girl's features, but then the wall was in front of him, and he used his spiritual nature to go right through it, heading for Kurosaki's family as he let the boy and girl behind to fight each other. After all, they only needed one of the two to be alive for the plan to work, and afterwards, the victor was going to be so emotionally devastated by finding the rest of the Kurosaki slaughtered, they would be left a mess. It was the best possible result, and Shukuro was really looking forward to it. Ichigo could see the shock in his enemy's eyes as he interfered with the attempt to stop Shukuro from going to help Karen, Yuzue, and the old man. Then, the Arrancar went on to pout in exactly the way Orium would, and Ichigo could feel a sense of pain in his chest at that, just like when he'd taken on the look of his mom. Eren Nero's impression of Orium was flawless, precisely matching the very way Orium would look when she was annoyed with him. Ichigo, Tsukishima is gonna hurt your sisters. We need to stop him. Shukuro is my friend, he's going to protect them, not hurt them. That made her face shift to surprise, once again replicating the real Orium's expression of confusion to perfection, just as her voice did. Tsukushima? I thought you'd never met him. Ichigo scoffed. The expressions might be spot on, but the Hollow clearly didn't have a full grasp of Orium's memories if he thought that. Probably it took some time to fully absorb the information after assimilating his victims, which caused Ichigo's anger to flare as he remembered what it meant, that Eren Nero was wearing Orium's form now. He'd destroyed one of the most important people to him, killed her in a way that made her beyond reach despite the fact he could visit the afterlife whenever he wanted, and all of it, he knew, had only happened because he'd been too weak, losing to Ulquiorra, failed to protect his friends. He wasn't about to make that mistake again. Without waiting, Ichigo immediately went on the attack, swinging Zanjutsu while glaring with enough hatred to make the fake Orium flinch. However, one of her static walls formed on its own right next to her face, stopping the blade in its tracks. He glared through the semi-transparent pane of white light, another thing the monster had stolen from his friend, and growled. Shukuro risked his life to infiltrate Aizen's forces because I asked. That's how good of a friend he is. The fake Orium looked at him dumbfounded and asked, in a confused tone. Tsukishima is a double agent? Like in a spy movie. It was incredible the extent Eren Nero was willing to go to mock him. Now not only the expression, but the words as well sounded just like what Orium would use. He shouted, "Don't pretend that you don't know, you wouldn't have been trying to kill him if you hadn't found out," and then, continuing to use his right hand to keep pressure with the sword that was just inch from the Arrancar's face, he drew Getsuga with his left in a reverse grip with his left, so that he could strike from the opposite side, at an angle that the shield wouldn't cover, in a single smooth motion. His enemy's answer was to have Orium's other three fairies form a shield on her other side, which increased his rage even further, so he decided to make use of it and kicked, using Hakuta to turn the wave of riot so that the kick released into a wave of flames that slammed straight into the girl. At the last moment, he saw the Arrancar call on a limited version of the Fullbringer armor that Ichigo himself had learned from Chad and taught to Orium. Clearly, Eren Nero was really trying his hardest to sell the ruse, but then, the Arrancar would regenerate from the wound anyway if his attempt to use only Orium's abilities failed, so Ichigo could see why it would at least make the attempt. In any case, while the defense was barely good enough, it at least kept the fake Orium from being set on fire, resulting in the clash of Ryotsu just sending her sliding backwards. Ichigo judged that the impact had been strong enough to send the Arrancar smashing into the wall, but it reached to the ground with one hand, Ryotsu flowing from its finger, to use Orium's Fullbringer powers to increase the floor's friction, slowing itself just enough that it stopped its movement before smashing into the wall. The Arrancar looked up, with Orium's stolen face set in an expression of sudden understanding as it said, Tsukishima used his power on you, didn't he? And now you trust him, and think I'm the monster you fought, the body snatcher." Ichigo grit his teeth and countered, barely keeping himself from shouting so that he wouldn't give his enemy an opening. "Shukuro is my friend, he'd never use his power on me. And you can stop pretending to be Orium already, it won't make me go easier on you, and in fact, it's only giving me more motivation to take you down as hard and painfully as I'm capable of doing." The expression on the fake Orium's face turned sad for a brief moment, before hardening in one of steely determination, the eyes burning with passion the very way those of the true one would when she reached a firm conviction to do something as she slowly straightened, a fist to her chest. "He's brainwashed you. That happens sometimes, but don't worry, I won't let you stay like that. I'm always going to be at your side, and if that means fighting to stop you from doing something you'll regret, then I'm going to do it." Ichigo decided he'd had enough of it, and pulled back his swords from he barriers so that he could move, which made Orium's eyes widen, and then used Shunpo and Hakuta together, the first to lighten himself and the second set to repulsion to send himself forward. It wasn't as fast as Sonito, but her had a lot more control on his movement this way, and since he could leave the movement of both swords to Zanjutsu and Shiro respectively, he was able to focus entirely on closing in. His approach was slowed when the air around the fake Orium turned suddenly thick like syrup as she flooded it with her Ryotsu, which was just another proof he was facing a copy, while he'd trained his friend into using the technique against a fast-charging opponent, she'd never once throughout their training been able to deploy it this fast. Still, it didn't matter, as the fact that his swords each had a mind of their own allowed them to correct their trajectory mid-swing in a way which would have been impossible otherwise. To his surprise, the Arrancar didn't try to either dodge, which would have been the best way to avoid a hit, or even attempt a block that would open the chance for a counter-attack. Instead, it dove into one of the strikes, intercepting Getchuga with Orium's sword and then pushing into it. This caused Zanjitsu's strike to go wide and miss, while the sheer weight behind the charge into Getchuga allowed the Arrancar to push the blade away and barrel past it, tumbling through. It was a ridiculously bad move to make, because now the enemy was unbalanced and with their back exposed to Ichigo, but that was what made it so unexpected that Ichigo hesitated for a fraction of a second before launching his attack, trying to spot what the trap was. Then Shiro warned him of the 6 fairies that were flying back toward him, and he had to roll out of the way to avoid them. If he'd not hesitated, he probably would have been able to strike his enemy before he was hit, which suggested the sloppy move had been meant to make him hesitate. Ichigo grimaced, realizing that Eren Nero was going to be even more tricky an opponent than he'd already expected, and promised to himself he wouldn't hesitate again, no matter what. Still, that didn't solve the problem that, now, 3 of the fairies were orbiting around the fake Orium in the shape of balls of golden light, while 2 more had set themselves along the edge of the Zanpakuto in the copy's hand. That was going to make any approach far more dangerous, since, while he could regenerate with Shiro's help, the Espada would recover faster, so he couldn't be taking the kind of injuries that sword would inflict. At least, not without inflicting 3 times as much on his opponent, which, he resolved, was exactly what he would be doing, if given half the chance. Learn, Zanjitsu. His Zanpakuto transformed into its Shikai state, and he could see his opponent tense at the sight, but Ichigo didn't let that distract him other than by taking notice of it, trying to decide the best way to attack. He didn't want to use something too destructive, both because he was currently in his real body rather than in spiritual form, and because repairing his father's clinic would cost a lot, so he'd rather not trash it. Of course, that would go out of the window the moment his opponent started to destroy the environment first, but until then, Ichigo rather thought that taking advantage of the restricted space would help. And it didn't mean he didn't have options, either. He aimed his Zanpakuto at the Arrancar and immediately extended it, only for the triangular shield of Orium's power to appear in its path, stopping it. He could feel the wall trying to push back against the tip of his blade, but he and Orium had verified that there was a limit to how much strength and speed she could put into her movable shields, and he knew that he could push stronger than she could push back. It didn't seem like the Arrancar stealing the power had made it faster, so Ichigo kept pushing, slowly forcing the wall back. That was when the fake Orium surprised him again by making the floor slipper and sliding to the side, out from the protection of the shield, sword swinging. Midway through it, the fairy that was orbiting her forehead shot itself forward, forming a new triangular wall, but this one attached to the sword like an extension of it, the way the 2 of them had practiced it. It was a risky move, because even if it gave the Arrancar the chance to extend his own blade, it also created an open target that Ichigo immediately targeted by swinging Getchuga to launch a slashing blade of Ryutsu. However, suddenly Ichigo felt himself stumble, his attack going wide, and realized that his opponent had dispersed the wall that he had been pushing against with Zanjitsu, so that his own momentum had been used against him. It was an unconventional tactic, especially because the Espada he's fought this far would get far more out of using their own strength rather than using his own against him, but he couldn't deny the efficacy as the extended blade cut into his collarbone. Even unbalanced like he was, his reflexes were quick enough for him to dodge backwards, leaving the cut relatively shallow, but it was still first blood, and he could see in Orium's stolen eyes that his opponent wouldn't stop, even as the copy raised the sword again. It seemed he needed to use a different approach. He went to retreat, and the triangular wall formed around Zanjitsu's extended blade, severing the tip of the blade, but Ichigo ignored it, shortening the blade end, in the process, returning it to its proper shape, while he thrust repeatedly with Getchuga, sending a dozen of piercing blades of black Ryutsu straight at his opponent. Eren Nero moved the wall to intercept them, which was just what Ichigo wanted, as even as he kept the barrage up, he used full bring to make the floor elastic like a trampoline under his feet, sending himself flying forward even as he continued to keep the shield engaged with his long-range Getchuga attacks. A widening of the fake Orium's eyes made the realization of what had happened clear, but there wasn't much the Arrancar could do against Ichigo's success at cornering them. He immediately followed up the closing in by striking with Zanjutsu, and his opponent responded with another of the techniques he's practiced with the real Orium, by punching with a shield spinning on the forearm like in Hacksaw. Normally, that was the type of attack that one had to dodge, since the edge of the shield was capable of cutting through anything the same way the lines the fairies formed would, which was probably why the fake Orium's eyes widened when Ichigo went for a straight block with Zanjutsu, the spinning of the shield stopping as Zanjutsu's edge locked it in place. Ichigo grinned, trying to put some arrogance into it, to spook his opponent. In truth, it was a very simple application of his Shikai's power to absorb the kinetic energy, giving the shield its acceleration, keeping it still that way rather than thanks to stronger durability, but if he could leave the creature doubting the effectiveness of the powers it had stolen, perhaps it would stop trying to impersonate his friend. However, for whatever reason, his enemy seemed almost pleased, and Ichigo was close enough to hear the whispered "That's so cool." Before the shield suddenly broke apart, the three fairies flying forward to slam into his chest with brutal power. Ichigo grunted as he took the attack, but countered the pushback from the hit by channeling the energy Zanjutsu had just absorbed, which left him free to use Hakuta to cover his chest with affection-charged Ryutsu, trapping the three fairies there, since they couldn't form connecting lines if they couldn't see each other. At the angle they'd hit him, that meant the 3 of the 6 fairies were now removed from the fight, since they weren't strong enough to break free without the benefit of their time-stopping power, and although it did limit Ichigo somewhat to be forced to keep the ability up rather than using anything else to reinforce his chest, the fact he could just pass the duty of keeping focus on it to Shiro meant he wouldn't be impeded in fighting at all. In fact, he already was, as the moment Zanjutsu's blade hit the ground due to the shield disappearance, Ichigo used full bring to make the floor elastic so that it bounced back, and the Zanpakuto itself corrected its movement to aim toward impaling the fake Orium. The attack didn't connect, as the Arrancar threw itself into the wall to the side, and then, in a crazy move, the wall disappeared, even if Ichigo hadn't stopped a moment to send hits from that side with Getsuga. It took Ichigo a moment to realize the Arrancar hadn't dismissed the shield entirely, but rather shrunk it into a smaller size and affixed it to one arm, and used it to charge into the attacks once again. Due to the smaller size of its protection, several grazed it, leaving bleeding cuts, but the majority were pushed away, allowing the fake Orium to break through the barrage. It was the second time his opponent dove straight into an attack and powered through it instead of trying to avoid it, and while it made sense for somebody with regeneration to go with such a risky strategy, it really didn't fit at all with what he remembered of Eren Nero's style, with its big focus on misdirection. Ichigo wondered what was causing the Espada to take such a strange, improvisation-heavy approach to the fight, but it was clear that Ichigo needed to find some counter to it if he wanted to win. As if to prove this, his opponent continued the effort to take surprising course of action by raising the shield and forming 3 lines, once from each corner of it to one of the 3 fairies stuck to Ichigo's chest. A moment later, the lines shrunk suddenly, pulling Ichigo toward the fake Orium and her Zanpakuto, which was raised to impale him once he was close enough. Doing the only thing he could, Ichigo immediately switched the charge of the Ryutsu on his chest to repulsion, pushing the fairies away so that he could slow himself down, which he did by stabbing Getsuga into the ground, since his opponent had also made the ground slipper so that Ichigo could be pulled close more easily. Even these combined efforts weren't enough to completely stop his forward momentum, but it gave Ichigo the time he needed to adjust his position and then channel hardened determination over himself. The result was that, when the tip of the fake Orium's Zanpakuto smashed into his chest, it was deflected and pushed away, leaving a clean opening for Ichigo to thrust Zanjutsu forward, or it would have, if 2 of the fairies hadn't charged straight at the blade, a line of light between them, cutting through the steel with absolute ease and sending the top half of Ichigo's Zanpakuto flying away. With the blade shortened like that, the fake Orium had just the bit of extra time necessary to put the shield attached at her forearm in the way, intercepting the strike. Still, even with the blade broken and the shield keeping it from penetrating, the strength behind Ichigo's thrust sent his opponent smacking into the bed, causing Eren Nero to stumble for half a second, and wasting no time, Ichigo passed control of his body to Shiro while the Hollow's mask appeared over his head, and with the increased speed and strength of his hollow side, delivered a brutally powerful knee strike at his opponent's abdomen, which caused them to bend forward in pain, exposing the back of its head to Shiro's follow-up headbutt, strong enough to send the copy crashing into the ground. Ichigo took back control as he stabbed down with a reformed Zanjutsu, while his opponent rolled over, bleeding heavily from the face but with eyes blazing with absolute determination as the shield affixed to the arm of the Arrancar enlarged and stopped the sword from hitting. Then the fake Orium stabbed upwards with the Zanpakuto in her hand, but Ichigo easily brought Getsuga to bear, stopping the blade, since it currently didn't have any fairies granting it an invincible edge. Instead, those fairies, the same one that had severed Zanjutsu, converged back, connecting together into another triangular shield just before they smashed into Ichigo's back. The power of the hit would have normally been strong enough to smash him down, but since he could channel his Shikai's power along his skin, as he'd instinctively done when he'd used it to withstand Kenpaku's spiritual pressure, Ichigo used it to absorb the impact instead, and then channeled it into the tip of Zanjutsu, which resulted in the shield that was stopping the blade being slammed further downward, straight into the body and face of his opponent, causing some more bleeding to start, marring the clothes the copy was wearing. Still, his opponent glared at him in defiance, so he focused on Getsuga Tensho. Normally, he would need to swing the blade to project the Ryutsu from it, which wasn't going to happen when the black sword was locked in a block against the fake Orium's flower pattern Zanpakuto, but now, Shiro was living in the blade, which gave it a bit more of an intelligence. With just a request, the hollow understood what he needed, and a moment later, the blade started to glow before Ryutsu erupted from the blade without a movement. Each Ryutsu blade that it fired immediately exploded onto the other Zanpakuto, and while it didn't damage the blade itself, the hand holding it was another matter, as the sheer speed and quantity of attacks he was unleashing made it the equivalent of holding something still while it was being hit by a jackhammer. He could see the hand trembling as the attack continued, bleeding cuts opening along the wrist from the sheer strain, and although his opponent was still resisting, it was clearly only a matter of time before he could win. Thus, he was caught completely by surprise when his enemy snapped its fingers, and the shield that was holding back Zanjutsu disappeared as the three fairies at its corners scattered, while the wall at Ichigo's back suddenly pushed him down again, with twice the strength and speed it had before. The suddenness, unexpected recklessness of the move kept him from using his Shikai, so that Zanjutsu plunged into the fake Orium's abdomen and then through, pinning the Arrancar to the ground with Ichigo on top of it. And then, he felt Zanjutsu's blade being cut down, and as he moved backwards, he stumbled into a light wall. They were inside a small, glowing pyramid of white light. In moving away, he drew Zanjutsu out of the body of his opponent, the movement causing a spray of blood to erupt from the wound and splatter all over his chest, and it was as he felt the hot, sticky liquid on his chest that, suddenly, Ichigo remembered that hollow only bleeds smoke, and Arrancar not at all. A sudden sense of vertigo come over him as he watched the battered, bruised and bloodied figure in front of him, even as the healing effect of the pyramid slowly got to work, the healing slowly reverting the body to an undamaged state, in a way that was nothing at all like hollow regeneration. He could see flesh knitting itself together, skin slowly regaining its natural color, and blood being drawn back into the wound, as Orium's healing worked by returning the body to its previous state. And, with her eyes still burning with the same endless determination she'd been sporting throughout the entire battle, the girl in front of him said with steel in her voice, even as she pointed her sword at him. "I'm not going to give up on you, Ichigo. I'm going to keep fighting until you finally figure out that you were wrong. I don't know how, but that's what an hero does when his friend is being brainwashed. So I'll keep fighting until I find a way to make you believe me." He wasn't sure what to say. Even Shiro and Zanjutsu didn't seem able to suggest him what he should say, so he went with the obvious. "Orium? Is that really you?" She pouted, placing her hand that wasn't holding the sword at her waist, and answered angrily. "Yes. I've been telling you the whole time, I didn't get eaten by the bad guy, I'm just me. Tsukishima lied to you, he's the bad guy here." He stared, his eyes moving from the place where the wound on her abdomen where he'd stabbed her still hadn't finished closing, to what blood that was still on Zanjutsu's currently broken blade, before looking at her again. "Why would you fight me? What you were thinking? I could have killed you." She looked genuinely puzzled, and then went on to smile confidently in that way Orium so often did, as she answered. "Now don't be silly. I know you would never kill me. Ichigo couldn't help but feel shaken at the knowledge that the only thing that had stopped him from using Zero and large-scale attacks like cutting through the building to collapse it on her had been the specific place this fight had taken place in. He very much would have killed her, if the circumstance had been even just a bit different, and the mere idea was terrifying. And yet, as she gazed into her eyes, he could see the surety of her own certainty. Orium truly, genuinely believed he was better than he knew himself to be, and for a moment there, he couldn't help but feel the need to validate that belief, to prove that he could be as good as she thought he was. Still, the face that Orium had been so willing to take the risk was ridiculously reckless, and she really ought to recognize it. Thus, he raised his broken, if slowly regenerating, Zanpakuto and pointed it at the point where he'd impaled her and asked, pointedly, "And what of that?" She shook her head and answered, in the same happy tone, "Well, of course if we fight we're gonna get a bit banged up, you know? That's what the healing is for." As if to emphasize her point, she waved her hands at the pyramid of light they were currently encased by. Ichigo let out a long sigh, and then commented, bemused, "You really can't count on this so much. If you get knocked unconscious it won't work. And to go to such lengths just to make me realize my mistake." "Of course I would." Orium looked genuinely angry for a moment there, a fist to her chest, as she went on, emphatically, to say, "I was serious when I said I love you. I'm ready to do anything if it helps you." Ichigo raised his eyebrows at that. "You just tried your best to hurt me. I thought love meant always being at somebody's side." Orium shook her head with great emphasis. "Not at all. It's about always supporting somebody, but you can't support a person if you're enabling their bad habits. When that happens, then supporting a person means being ready to smack sense into them." She nodded decisively at that, and Ichigo couldn't help but chuckle, which caused Orium to calm down a bit, smiling back. He still had no idea what to make of Orium's love confession, since it really wasn't something he had any experience with, but he hadn't forgotten his father's words, and while he didn't know if he truly wanted to become the person Orium believed he could be in full, he did think at least a bit of that feeling was there. Enough to try things out, at least. So Ichigo said, in a reasonable tone, "Well, I'm not sure if I love you back or not, but I think, once all this is over, maybe we could go out together sometimes, and try to figure that out." Orium was shocked, and then genuinely happy, and if Ichigo had any doubt left that this wasn't the real one, which he didn't, that would have dispersed them. He didn't think Hollow, who had trouble feeling most emotions, could fake such a level of happiness. Still, he pushed the thought aside. This fight might have helped him figure out himself a bit more, but he hadn't forgotten how it had come about in the first place. So, when Orium breathlessly asked really, he answered in a serious tone with yes, but that's for later. Right now, we have a false friend to catch. Orium's face showed some surprise at that as she asked, looking at him. "So, you believe me then, that he brainwashed you?" Ichigo grimaced. The memories of his friendship with Tsukishima were still there, and he still felt like he should trust him, but if nothing else, he lied to me about you. I'm going to want answers about that, and with your words in mind, I need to go check what's going on with my family. My dad is though, but we should still hurry to make sure nothing happened. Orium's eyes widened at that, and then she dismissed the pyramid, and the two of them began to run. He didn't know anymore why Shukuro had lied, but whatever the reason, even should it have been an honest mistake, Ichigo wanted answer, and he would get them. Karen had to put some effort into it to roll herself so she wasn't facing the floor, and just that was enough to rip another scream out of her lips as the pain the movement inflicted on her. Each breath she took was also painful, but it was a more subdued thing, like somebody was pressing down on her chest, and each time she took air in, the press scraped against her. It was continuous, rather than sudden, and that dulled it, if barely. From her new position, she could see that Ichigo's friend, Tsukishima, was looking down at her dad from where he was standing, down on one knee, in front of Yuzu's unconscious form. Karen had no idea why the man had started to attack them. He'd just said that it was time for them to die, and provided no other reason, but she knew that he was terrifying. Ishine had been quick to attack him when he'd said that, but his sword had to be poisoned or something, before after the first time Tsukishima had managed to land a glancing blow on his forearm. Her dad's movement had become slower, not by much, but enough Karen had noticed, and enough that Tsukishima had suddenly become capable of dancing through them, as if it was a choreography he'd practiced a million times. She had tried to use the full bring power her dad had taught her to make the air thicker and slow Tsukishima down, but he hadn't been affected at all, and had ignored her like she wasn't even there. Yuzu then went and copied her, and she'd managed to make the ground slippery and let his hind get a hit in, but Tsukishima hadn't liked that at all, and had shot her with a laser or something, and now Karen's little sister was on the ground, unconscious and bleeding, and with being forced to defend her, their dad hadn't been able to keep dodging and escaping. It had meant that, instead of reducing the house to the ravaged wreckage it currently looked like, as they had been doing until then, all of Tsukishima attacks suddenly had a static target, and it hadn't taken long for his hind to be left a mess, badly wounded and with many of his weapons destroyed, while Tsukishima smiled smugly. Karen had tried again to help, to do anything, but no matter how much she tried, using full bring was too hard for her. She'd been envious, a little bit, of how much more easily Yuzu had taken to it when they were training. It just wasn't right for the little sister to be better at these violent things, but now, Karen hated herself because she hadn't been strong enough to protect Yuzu. She hated her own jealousy, because she couldn't help but think that, if Yuzu had been just a bit better, if she'd had been the sole focus of their dad's lessons without Karen there to drag her out, she might have managed to avoid Tsukishima's attack, or done something else that didn't result with her slumped on the ground like that. Even when she'd given up on trying to use special powers and just tried to kick the bastard in the shins, Karen had failed utterly. Tsukishima had simply hit her with a backhanded slap, but unlike a normal slap, it had felt like his hand had been made of steel, and the hit had sent her flying straight into the wall. Unlike the 2 times Tsukishima had managed to slam his hind into them, the walls hadn't cracked or broken. Instead, she had felt her own insides breaking, as she'd rebounded to the ground and fell face first onto the floor. And now, all she could see was watch, powerless, as Tsukishima slowly advanced, and her dad, with his healing kit open in front of himself, tried to stop him, and failed. He threw syringes, and Tsukishima swatted them out of the air with the flat of his blade. He tried to hit with his threads, and Tsukishima's sword cut through them like they were butter, and the one time he tried to throw a scalpel, Tsukishima just waved his hand to create a small round shield of golden light which exploded when it was hit, sending the weapon wildly out of the way and forcing her dad backwards, closer to Yuzu's unconscious form and clearly on his last leg, sweat and blood both marring his face. Desperately, Karen inched forward, screaming as her chest felt like it had been set on fire by the effort, and reached for the remains of the tea table that had collapsed to the ground after a stray hit by Tsukishima's sword in the previous battle, and grabbed the first thing in reach, a broken teacup, before throwing it at the man while screaming out loud. "Leave my family alone, monster!" Tsukishima didn't try to dodge, nor turn, or even glance at her projectile, and she understood why as, when it reached him, the cup went through his body as if it was made of air, shattering on the ground at his other side without causing him any harm. The man let out an arrogant laugh, continuing to keep his attention fully on his hind as he said, sounding amused. "Don't worry, little pest, I'll get around to finish you off in a moment, just let me take care of your little sister first." His hind roared at that and went for a stab with the last scalpel he had left into his healing kit, but Tsukishima's hand caught his wrist, and then twisted with suddenness, a snapping sound and a grunt of pain followed by the sound of the weapon falling to the ground, the only signs he'd stopped her dad and disarmed him. Then, the man raised his sword high above his head, preparing to deliver a decapitating strike as he said, his voice mocking. "I want you to know, I might be taking care of you first, but your kids will be following shortly. Make sure that is your last thought, yes." Desperately, Karen reached for the next nearest thing in the remains of the tea table, a silver table knife, and when her hand closed around it, she remembered the one single Ichigo had given her, and going more by instinct than by conscious thought, Karen called all of the power she could to the knife even as she threw it at the man who was about to kill her family. As if flew, she could see the glowing blue spirit particles collecting on the blade, making it seem much bigger. Once again, Tsukishima didn't even turn to check what she'd thrown, but this time, when the blade reached his kidney, it sunk in, the man's eyes widening in pain as his swing went wide, missing his hind and Yuzu both. It wasn't that big of an opening, but it was just enough for her dad to take advantage of it, roaring as he head-butted Tsukishima straight in his belly. The attack let out a ton of Ryotsu, more than Karen had ever seen her dad use, and Tsukishima was sent flying backwards, smashing into the wall and going through it, leaving it broken and damaged. Her dad grinned, then swayed and collapsed to the ground, and Karen remembered how he himself had warned her that releasing more Ryotsu than one head could cause somebody to have dizzying spells, or even fall unconscious if it was too much. How typical of him, Karen thought with fondness, to ignore his own advice. After the chaos of the battle, the silence her dad's victory had caused was almost blissful. Karen tried to focus on breathing. If the breaths were small and brief, the pain of her chest hurt less, and right now, that was about all that she could do. Still, she felt a certain satisfaction. She might not have done much, but it was only because of the trick she'd asked Ichigo to teach her that none of them had died. Now she just needed for her big brother to finally show up and help them, but at least, they didn't have to worry. She wasn't sure how long it was that she basked in that contentment and focused on regulating her breathing. It felt like a few minutes, but it was difficult to say. She did know that it was Tsukishima's voice that shattered it. "You'll pay for that, you little bitch." Turning her head as much as she was able, which wasn't much, Karen saw the tall figure of Tsukishima slowly heaving himself through the hole he'd made in the wall. He did look like his Hein's attack had hurt him, and the side where she'd stabbed him was bleeding lightly, but he was obviously far from beaten. And meanwhile, on the other side of the room, she could see that her dad, much as he was trying, was struggling to just get back on his knees, let alone stand. Tsukishima didn't seem to care about his Hein, however, as he was slowly stalking toward her as he said, his tone venomous. "Did you think that was a good idea? Perhaps satisfied that you've at least managed to give me a bloody nose before I got you, went down fighting? Well, let me disabuse you of the idea. All that you've gotten yourself is a much more painful death. I'm going to take you, and your little sister as well, and bring you to Las Noches, and then I'm gonna watch as the most ravenous and beastly hollow I can find tear you apart while eating you alive. Do you like that idea? Do you think that humiliating me like that, delaying your defeat by a few minutes at most, was worth it?" Karen wasn't sure what she wanted to answer. She wasn't even sure she had the strength to, right now. However, she didn't need to, as barely a fraction of a second after Tsukishima had finished his rant, a glowing blue beam slammed into him, sending him crashing into another wall, but instead of just a few bruises like her dad's attack had left behind, this one left the man bleeding and with his clothes lightly scorched, and a clearly discombobulated expression. Tsukishima glanced disbelievingly toward the hole in the wall, from which the beam had come, and when Karen did the same, she saw the figure of a tall man with broad shoulders and dark skin, which she recognized as Chad, one of Ichigo's friends. A bit behind him, hard to notice, was a girl with two long red pigtails and a ugly gun with a heart on it, who said while looking at Karen, "Sorry that took so long. I had to get somebody who could take this guy on before coming to the rescue. I really couldn't have helped any faster than this." Karen had no idea what the redhead was talking about, but Tsukishima looked incensed. Karen had noticed that he really disliked it when people dismissed him or his capabilities, and darted back to his feet screaming, "I'll show you who can take who," before waving one hand to send a dozen golden lasers at the newcomers while also clearly preparing to do something with his sword. However, Ichigo's friend Chad was already punching the moment Tsukishima had opened his mouth, and the moment he finished throwing his punch, another huge beam erupted from it, completely catching and destroying all of the lasers and hitting Tsukishima before he could do whatever he was planning, sending him rolling backwards again with even more bruises and burns. While he hadn't expected to get hit, this time the man was better prepared for it, as he managed to roll backwards and stop himself from smashing into the thing, as he leveled a glare at Chad. "I'm so going to make you regret that." "No, you will be the one who'll regret coming after my family, Shukuro." Karen grinned as she turned in the direction of the voice, and found that Ichigo was standing in the doorway, looking angry in a manner she'd never seen her big brother be before, with a sword in each hand. Orium was behind him, with a golden sword in one hand and a triangular golden shield on her arm, the way her long hairs were fluttering behind her making her look really badass, in Karen's opinion. Tsukishima seemed to think so as well, because, after taking in the people arrayed against him, even as Hein had finally managed to get back on his feet, even if swaying somewhat, he scoffed and reached with one hand for his pocket as he said, in a threatening tone, "This isn't the last you see of me, and next time, I'll make sure none of you survives." Then, a square pillar of light surrounded the man, and he disappeared. Karen heard Ichigo say, "Orium, quick, they need healing," and saw the older girl hurrying forward, so decided she had had enough excitement for one day, and closed her eyes, focusing on her breathing. She would find the time to ask what the meaning of this all was later. Right now, she was just happy that everybody she cared about was going to be fine. Chapter 88, Rebuilding. Ichigo wasn't sure if watching Yuzu sleep was helping soothe his nerves and reassure him that his little sister was alright, or if it was making him shiver, to think how close he'd come to losing her forever, and how pallid she still looked. Intellectually, he knew that she was fine. Orium had healed everybody after Tsukushima had ran away. Yuzu had simply gone back to sleep because she'd overtired herself during the battle, but emotionally was another matter. It didn't help that he felt very responsible for what had happened. He'd been the one to introduce Tsukushima to his family and offered to let him sleep in their own house, given him the chance to in his family. He didn't feel too guilty, since it was Tsukushima's power to gain people's trust, but he still thought he had a level of culpability, because he really should have done more to make sure his family was safe. If Rukia hadn't had the idea of putting the Fullbringer up to guard the area, he didn't want to think what might have happened. You realize it's creepy to be sitting next to a young girl's bed and staring at her while she sleeps, right? His train of thought broken, Ichigo turned toward Karen, who was now staring at him from the doorway. Seeing her being abrasive helped him calm down. He could still feel some of her tension, but the fact she was back to putting on a strong face meant she had weathered the stress from her near-death experience as well as could be hoped for. However, rather than playing along with her usual routine of aggressive mocking, he said, in a grateful tone. According to Dad, you struck the crucial hit that saved everybody. If you hadn't, Chad would have been too late. You saved our family, Karen, thank you. His sister was taken aback by that, before pouting and saying, in a self-recriminating tone that matched the emotions she was feeling. That was just one lucky strike. Aside from that, I wasn't able to do anything at all. I tried to do what Father taught me, like Yuzu did, but I was so bad at it, it almost got us all killed. I'm useless at spirit fighting. Ichigo raised an eyebrow, remembering how quickly she'd taken up the trick he'd shown her, apparently the same one she'd used to stab Tsukushima, and nodded to himself. So you've a propensity for the Quincy arts, rather than Fullbring, while Yuzu is probably the opposite, since she took to Dad's lessons so quickly. I guess if you each took your personalities from one of our parents, it only makes sense you'd get your spiritual propensity from the other one. He felt it as Karen's confusion switched to annoyance, and let her kick him in the shin, only to regret it as it hurt more than he'd expected it to, while she said, in a threatening tone. You did not just imply I have the same shitty personality as Dad. Take that back. Ichigo raised his hands in surrender, holding back on a smirk, before going on with what he knew would be an effective peace offering. I also said that you take from Mom on one side, didn't I? You could learn to fight like she did. I could. She seemed genuinely surprised at the realization, but soon enough he could feel her emotions switching to a sense of reaffirmed confidence as she stated, of course I would be awesome like Mom, the boast mostly empty but with a kernel of conviction at its core that Ichigo was confident would give his sister a new direction to head towards. Wanting to encourage that, he said, I think so, yeah, before being struck by an idea and adding, and in fact, I think I will ask Ishida to teach you, he'd probably be better at it than I would be. While that's almost always a true statement, what in particular are you referring to here? Ichigo and his sister both turned toward the doorway Uriah was currently standing in, and Ichigo explained. Karen, here, has a propensity for the Quincy arts, and I thought you would be a better teacher for her in that, since you'd actually know what you were talking about. Uriah raised an eyebrow at that, before moving to look over Karen who, despite feeling anxious to Ichigo's senses, which likely meant Uriah knew she was as well, managed to put up a dismissive expression of her own as she said, her tone carrying the same dismissiveness she'd usually aim at Ichigo himself. This nerdy guy should be the one to teach me how to fight? He looks even less cool than you do. Ichigo grinned, but didn't otherwise comment, while Uriah continued to stare in silence for a few moments, just enough to make Karen's worry that she had overshot her pretended arrogance, before he finally said, in a deadpan tone. I'll give you a test to see where you stand, and then I'll decide if I want the bother of taking you as a student or not. It'll be soon, and I'll let you know at least one day in advance, so you better start preparing to make sure you'll be able to impress me. Then he turned toward Ichigo, making it impossible for Karen to add a word in between, and went on to say, "Rukia thinks we should bring you up to speed with the plan, so you should come over." Ichigo nodded, then got up, patting Karen's head as he did, prompting a scowl, and then whispering to her, "Keep them safe while I'm gone," which left his sister with a mix of worry, confusion, and pride, and then followed Urayu, the two of them making it to the new headquarters of the team quickly enough, Urahara having already keyed them both into the defenses so they didn't trigger any traps on their way in. Once they were gathered, Rukia began by addressing Ichigo directly with a nod. "So, while you were recovering, we've put together something of a plan already." Ichigo wasn't surprised by that. According to what he'd been told, his little conversation with Shiro had taken up 7 days of real time, but he did offer a wry smile in response. "If we already have a plan, couldn't you just have told me without calling up a whole meeting? It's not like I don't trust you to come up with a good strategy." Rukia paused for a moment at that, his words clearly affecting her somehow, but then shook her head, although with a matching smile of her own. "Well, you're half right, but there's still stuff we have to put the finishing touches to, and you'll want to have some input into it, I think." Then she motioned to Urahara, who smiled, picking up a small item the size and shape of a golden bottle cap from a pockety and placing it on the table. Ichigo didn't immediately recognize it, but when Orium at his side widened her eyes and said, "The teleport button," he understood that it was one of the devices that triggered the negation, which only Orium and Urayu in their group had used so far. Urahara smiled at Orium's comment and answered, in an amused tone. "Almost correct. I don't know if you're aware, but before leaving, Aizen had left hundreds of these scattered all over Soul Society. It's why it took me so long to join you here. I was helping Mayuri locate them all since he was hopeless at doing it on his own. However, upon examining them, we found out that a good deal of them weren't actually single-target beacons like the original ones. Instead, they were set up so that a group of a dozen or so individuals could be called to the same negation spot, by connecting multiple devices together. Each group would need to be pre-linked, but it would still have allowed Aizen to summon a number of strike forces inside the walls of Soul Society." Urahara paused, then added, with a bit of chagrin. "I imagine that he told us of the devices so that we would unknowingly be testing them on his behalf when we went to rescue Rukia. He used us as his pawns, and if Tuan had succeeded at killing me, then it's almost certain we would have missed some of them and he would have had the ability to strike behind Soul Society's defenses at will." A heavy silence followed that, as Ichigo considered the kind of damage that a single unexpected strike teams of Arrancar had made when attacking them in Karakura, and what it would look like if multiple of those did the same thing, but in the middle of a pitched battle. Luckily, Orium quickly broke the tension by saying, in a happy tone, "It's a good thing Nemia was there to save you, right?" That caused Urahara to recover his good humor. It was, and her help didn't stop there. By putting the entire 12th Division to work on it together, we were able to reverse engineer the structure of these group-targeted negation, and then improved on them. As he said that, he slid 4 more discs onto the table. They were very similar to the first one, but about half again the size and 3 times the thickness. They also were glowing green. These are similar to Aizen's group-targeted negation, but instead of being linked to a dozen people, we managed to link each one to 3,000. A single press of a button, and an entire Godai 13 division will be appearing directly at the destination. Rukia leaned forward, a serious expression on her face, as she took over the explanation. Our plan was already for Tatsuki to give her a handful of negation devices to Hiyori so that she could activate them to teleport a few of us into Lost Noches once she had verified that Hiriko was alive, but now we can give her these as well, and when the time comes, we turn Aizen's own plan back against him, and crush Lost Noches under the weight of 4 full divisions. Ichigo nodded along, then frowned and asked, "Why only 4? Why not all 13? Rukia shook her head, and explained. "After defeating you, Ulquiorra threatened us, saying that the structures they've been building across the city this last month are a way to open a passage directly to the Throne of Heavens, and that soon enough Aizen will be bringing his army here and punch through the barrier by activating them, which can only be done by slaughtering everybody in the town." Ichigo's mouth went dry at that. The idea that Aizen might have plans to kill an entire town just to break through a barrier seemed madness, but then, the only thing he was sure he understood about the man by now was that he didn't understand him at all. Still, he shook his head and asked, keeping his panic from showing in either his Ryotsu or his voice. "If that's so dangerous, Shouldn't we be rushing to launch the attack? You're forgetting that we can't do it on our own timetable. We need to wait for Ulquiorra to come and invite Hiri into their lair. Which means we can't be sure of what time they'd do it at. Yumi Chika nodded along. In the worst-case scenario, Aizen might time the invitation to the Vizard and the attack on Karakura to coincide in their timing. And planning for Aizen to follow the strategy that would put us in the greatest difficulty is only wise. Ichigo nodded at Uriu's words, then glanced around at the group and, seeing that they didn't look as worried as he was, he calmed down himself, as he realized what this likely meant. You have a solution to that? Rukia nodded. Of course, we'll just need to leave some troops ready to protect Karakura. That way, if Aizen's army shows up before we can act, we'll have a quick response force ready to intercept him. We presented the idea to the Captain Commander, and once he learned of the threat to the throne, he agreed that it was the best plan of action. Ichigo let out a long breath, knowing that a defense plan had already been put into place helped his worry somewhat. He tried to refocus, and went on to ask. So, how are we doing this? Will you be scattering half the negation devices in Karakura and hand the other half over to Tatsuki? Urahara shook his head. Actually, we don't even have that many. These 4 are all that the 12th Division was able to create on such short notice. If we have more time, we might be able to craft more, but it's not a quick process. That was when Renji spoke up, in an annoyed tone. Besides, even if we had that many, the Captain Commander wouldn't agree. He wants to keep at least 1/3 of the Godii forces to stand guard over the Suryatii, to make sure nobody manages to sneak past our forces and find the place undefended. Ichigo grimaced, but nodded in understanding. As nice as it would have been to have 6 or 7 captains guarding Kakuruka, it made perfect sense that Yamamoto would want to ensure his home was protected as well. He let out a long breath, then focused on Rukia. This is all good to know. I'm still not sure what else I should contribute to this, however, seems to me like you have it all in hand. Rukia smiled wryly, then went on to say. Although you would want to decide for yourself whether you want to join the force attacking Las Noches, or if you'd rather stay here and keep watch on Karakura. Oh. Ichigo hadn't considered that, and now that it was put in front of him, he realized it was a pretty hard decision to make. On one hand, he wanted to keep his family and everybody else here safe. On the other hand, bringing the fight directly to Aizen's doorstep as soon as possible was still the fastest way to solve this all with the least possible amount of casualties. And, as a different but related consideration, staying in Karakura, training, and preparing for a fight on prepared ground, would be more time efficient and less risky than charging ahead in the enemy's own fortress with no knowledge of which traps were laying in wait. But it also felt like it was far too passive and reactive an approach, with a threat on the scale of the danger ahead. Taking proactive action to put as quick an end to it as feasible seemed like the better way to handle things. He glanced around at the others, trying to get a sense for their disposition. Urahara and Yumi Chika seemed tense, although the former in a less collected, more eager manner than the latter, while Ikeku and Chad had the relaxed expression of somebody who already knew what they would be doing. Uriah was inscrutable, while next to Ichigo, Orim was almost vibrating, clearly more than ready to jump into action as soon as possible. Renji seemed hesitant, glancing toward a very serious Rukia, who looked at Ichigo with patience, clearly not wanting to let everybody else's choice bias him, so that he could truly decide what was that he truly wanted. After considering for a moment, Ichigo asked, looking Rukia in the eyes. If I asked you which divisions will be sent to Las Noches, which to guard Soul Society, and which ones that'll come here to Karakura, would you tell me? Rukia raised an eyebrow and countered. Why does it matter? Even if you know which captains will be deployed that shouldn't influence your decision, right? She let a beat pass, then sighed and added, in a friendly tone, if you try to find a rational reason to justify picking one choice over the other, instead of following your heart, you're going to regret it, Ichigo. I can't let a friend hurt themselves like that. Ichigo saw what she meant, and he felt a certain gratitude to that. In fact, he even agreed with the spirit of Rukia's suggestion, making a decision this important without considering the emotional aspect, only keeping in mind tactical considerations, would leave him uncertain and perhaps cause him to hesitate at a crucial moment. And even if that didn't happen, all it'd take was for somebody to get badly hurt at a location he wasn't at despite having wanted to be there, for him to feel guilty about it forever. In this case, however, there was another factor to consider, so Ichigo offered Rukia a sad smile and said, "I appreciate the concern, really, I do, but there are some things I learned that I think are too important to ignore." His hand closed on the handle of Getsuga at his side, and explained. "Shiro, that's the name of my inner hollow, is now finally willing to fully cooperate with me, and has revealed me a lot of stuff. The most important bit is that he was working under Aizen before, even if he didn't know the name back then, that's why Aizen knew his location and sent you to hunt him down, Rukia." That caused a murmur to go through the room, while Rukia frowned and said, with a frown, "He'd just told me that a very dangerous hollow had been spotted in the area, one who'd be too much for a random local Shinigami to take on. You're saying he just wanted to get rid of a potential mole?" "It's more than just that. He also wanted you to showcase the Oswald in a place where many Quincy would have a chance to see it." According to Shiro, Aizen always knew it could absorb hollow as well as Zanpakuto spirits, and Shiro himself had been working alongside Grand Fisher to make Karakura a focal point of Quincy attention before he deserted Aizen forces. That caused Urayu to speak up, looking troubled. "You're sure about that? What use would that be?" Ichigo shrugged. "I've no idea, and Shiro doesn't know either, but you know what the situation with the Quincy is like better than any of us. If anybody has a chance to figure out what his goals are, you would be it." Urayu grimaced, then shook his head. "I can't think of anything right now, but I see why you say that this would change things. It doesn't matter what I want, if there's a chance that Aizen might attack the Quincy, or otherwise try something against them, I need to be here so I can counter it." Ichigo nodded, then turned back to Rukia and went on to say, "Which applies to me as well. While Shiro can't give us a clean route to Las Noches, he's been there before, he knows the environment, and while the names of the Espada we know didn't say anything to him, if he met them in person he could be able to recognize them and give us their weaknesses." Rukia frowned. "So, because of that, you feel like you have to join the team that will be striking at Aizen directly?" Ichigo nodded, decision made, and as soon as he did, Orium jumped to her feet and declared, loud and clear, "And I'm going to come with Ichigo, and smash the bad guy's liar to pieces." She nodded decisively, and a moment later Chad said, in his usual serious, polite tone, "I will stay, in case Urayu need helps, and so that you can be sure somebody will be watching over your family, Ichigo. I feel these powers I have are meant to protect, not strike, you know that about me." Rukia let out a long breath and said, "It's decided then. I'll be part of the attack group as well. The 13th Division needs to guard Karakura, so that Captain Yukatake can try to attempt a counterspell to disrupt Aizen's ritual if everything else fail, and the attack team will need somebody well versed in Kido to take care of any trick Aizen might have ready." Ichigo nodded, his resolve hardening as he did. They had a plan of action, and while he was worried over the possible risk, it was better than nothing. Aizen had been left free to do what he wanted for long enough. It was time to show him that they weren't going to let him do as he wished unopposed. It was time to bring the fight to him. Chapter 89, Kenpeki. Zaraki had to admit, feeling giddy like he currently did wasn't a very frequent occurrence for him, which made the current situation even more unique, and thus exciting, than it already would be on its own. It was, after all, the chance of a lifetime. He'd not been able to spar with Retsu in centuries, and so that alone would make the experience worth it, but the fact that they were going to have an uninterrupted, month-long sparring session to make up for the lost time was all he could have ever asked for. He was aware, vaguely, that Retsu had wanted to get back to training him for a long time as well. From what he understood, there had been some law or other passed that stopped their sparring sessions because they were too destructive, or some such shit. Personally, he didn't see why that would be a problem. They had trained outside the outer limits of the Rokanga back when they'd been able to, so even if a couple hills got turned to craters in the process, nobody should really have cared much, but it didn't matter anymore, since the old man had lifted the rule so they'd be in top shape to fight off Aizen's forces. Zaraki couldn't help but think he should give some thanks to Jin for having made this happen, and he was resolved to do so when he finally meet him face to face again, before smashing it to a pulp in a fight that was sure to be a lot of fun. And, of course, there was the other bonus to the situation. Apparently, young Kisuk had cooked up a place where not only could he and Retsu let loose without trouble, but the training time would be extended, So, every day they spent there from the perspective of those outside would be the equivalent of an entire month of training. Of course, knowing Retsu, she was going to turn it into some grueling endurance test, but Zaraki was ready for that, and in fact, looked forward to it. In fact, he'd even made sure his division would not make trouble, just to avoid giving anybody reasons to interrupt his training with administrative bullshit. He'd left his orders to his hunters to spend their time training and without bothering anybody. The promise he'd give the lieutenant spot which that worm Tsukishima had left empty to whomever distinguished themselves the most in the upcoming war was exactly the sort of goal that would both give them a goal to train towards and a reason not to make too much of a mess while left unsupervised. Ikeku and Yumichika were even going to be going to the mortal realm with little Miss Kukiki in a couple of weeks or so, to help her make a deal with young Hiri, who apparently was one of Hiriko's visored. Zaraki had to wonder, after his fight with the girl Tatsuki, what a member of the 11th who was also a visored would be like, but the thought completely fled his mind as he and his guide entered a subterranean chamber, and a heavy stone sword slammed shut behind him. The place was vast, enough so that Zaraki couldn't see its end, and for a moment, it was completely dark, making it nearly impossible to see anything. It wasn't just a lack of light, but a very nearly absence of Ryotsu as well, except for the obvious bonfire that were his own and Retsu's. Everything else was nearly impossible to perceive. At least, until long, purple glyphs appeared all along the walls. Zaraki recognized them as the same type of effect as those who had created the fire traps he'd powered through the other day. He glanced at them, then turned toward his mentor with a grin. So, now whenever I want to get some extra training time in, I just need to come here. Retsu shook her head gently. The movement was barely visible with the way she was giving him her back. She'd been the one led him here, after all, although it was strange that she didn't turn even as she explained, in her usual polite and reassuring tone. Young Kisuk had to spend a whole day carving everything, and I had to help him fix the runes in place, otherwise they would have dispersed the moment he turned off his shikai. We used a kido to tie them to the doors, so that, as long as they were open, the effect would be kept in stasis and deactivated. The doors closing removed the stasis effect and triggered the slowed time effect over the entire area, but once the area is breached by opening the doors again, the effect will disperse. The explanation was a bit too complicated for Zaraki's taste, but he got the gist of it well enough. Retsu had to waste an entire day of her own time to set this place up, so it wasn't going to be usable often, and never without bothering her first. Something he doubted anybody other than him would ever dare to attempt. That's a shame. I'd have loved to have such a place to train in regularly. A soft laughter came from Retsu's form, even as Zaraki could see that she had moved her arms so that her hands had to be at about chest height. Then she said, in a soft tone, "Oh, we're going to have our fill of it, you need not worry. I am in control of the seal, after all, so even if somebody comes knocking, I won't let the doors open until I'm fully satisfied I have wrung all I can out of you." There was a certain playfully teasing tone to how Retsu was speaking, and Zaraki couldn't help but admire the way it worked to dissimulate her threat, make her appear, if not harmless, he doubted that would ever be possible, at least reassuringly poised. But Zaraki knew that it was but a ruse. In truth, Captain Retsu Anohana was a creature of pure destruction, the like of which was hard to comprehend for one who hadn't seen her full power unleashed. The air was sharp and crisp around her body because it knew, in so much as something without a mind could, that it could be shredded by a mere gesture from her, that it took all of her control to avoid tearing the world apart with every random movement. Many would think that the old man was a clearer example of indescribable power held back on a chain, and Zaraki had no illusion that the captain commander was above him in a similar manner as Retsu was, but the difference there was one of flavor. While the old man's power was obvious and, when unleashed, a devastating force of nature that none could stand against, the way Retsu's power manifested was more akin to the pull of gravity, subtle and almost unnoticeable at first, and something that one could struggle against or hold off for a time, but ultimately inexorable. It was a different type of monster, but it was a monstrous power all the same, and the fact that she could conceal it so well that most people only felt vague unease in her presence, instead of the paralyzing fright and heart-stopping terror that they should, was just another reason why he always longed to measure himself against her. It was why, whenever people called him a monster, he always felt the words as a compliment, no matter how they were meant to be read. After all, the more monstrous he was, the closer to her he'd be. The emotions he was feeling were so strong that they started to filter into his Ryutsu, the excitement and bloodlust giving it a combined sense of dryness and electrical charge that was slowly building up. Even as he kept it as contained as he could, a skill he was actually very good at, considering how much more Ryutsu than most others he had to keep under control on a daily basis just to keep people from just dying in his presence, the Ryutsu nevertheless affected the air around them. Retsu, of course, noticed immediately, and let out a small chuckle. "So eager, are you? I would say you to wait, but I'm actually in the same mood, just allow me to finish letting my hair down, and then we can get to have some fun." And, as if to punctuate those words, her left arm struck to the side, a white ribbon held into it, as the long braid she usually kept her long black hairs into fell apart. She turned, and her black hairs spun around her at the moment like long strands of black silk that reached all the way to her waist. When she stopped, they settled, most of them at her back but several bangs falling to her front, giving her a disheveled, almost wild air that was just emphasized by the large blue eyes that normally looked like placid lakes narrowing threateningly, while her normally motherly smile curled just slightly at the edges of her lips, suddenly looking sinister. Zaraki's own smile grew bigger and sharper in response, even as his eyes strayed to the point where her kimono closed, just under her collarbone, where a small puckered scar could be seen. The one over his eye pulsed in response, remembering the time they'd exchanged those, in the hardest fight of Zaraki's entire existence. Wounds to the soul only left scars when the attack that inflicted them had meaning to those receiving them. Knowing he was the one responsible for leaving on Captain Unohana the only scar she had never failed to get his blood boiling and him spoiling for a fight. Wandering eyes? Getting distracted like that is risky, it can give your opponent an opening. Even as he returned his attention to Captain Unohana's threatening gaze, Zaraki let his Ryutsu erupt out of him, unleashing as much of it as he could while still restrained by his eye patch. The ground cracked from the sheer pressure the Ryutsu exerted as he let it roll like a wave toward Retsu, only to fail to affect her at all, sliding off her form like oil on water. It had been ages since he'd last had his ability to exert spiritual pressure disrupted so thoroughly, and it was even more impressive because Retsu's own Ryutsu hadn't expanded of even a millimeter from its normally thickly contained shell, a clear mark of her absolute control. However, Zaraki wasn't about to give up after seeing his first effort rebuffed. So he forced his will more actively on the waves of Ryutsu that, despite having been deflected away from Retsu, still roiled around her, like a sea in a storm around a pillar of rock emerging from the waves. With as much control as he could, he gripped the Ryutsu with his will and had it raise around her in two intertwined, spiraling walls that grew tall and then crashed down on her with all of their strength. Once again, the attack failed to harm Retsu at all. But Zaraki had expected that and fed the Ryutsu that had fell down back into the two walls so that it would go up again, creating a never-ending cycle of crashing, crushing pressure, just like the never-ending fury of the sea could eventually cause even mountains to crumble. He was sure that, if he kept pounding without pause, the resistance of Retsu would eventually be eroded to nothing. Of course, she knew that as well, and almost immediately, he could feel her Ryutsu mixing with his own. It didn't expand in a powerful wave or explosion like his own had, or the old man's would, that wasn't her style. Instead, he could feel it as a presence slowly infiltrating his own, sliding in between the tight bond of the Ryutsu particles with the same ease as a knife would cut butter, because, of course, that was more or less exactly how Retsu would direct it. As usual, the more it seeped into it, the more her Ryutsu caused his own to lose cohesion. The feelings that she infused it with gave the Ryutsu a calming effect that acted as a paralytic on any Ryutsu and Reishi it came into contact with, and while a light touch with it could be used to induce a state of artificial calm, Zaraki knew that was just the bare application. Used to its true effect, like she was doing now, the real effect of the ability was revealed, as the Ryutsu was broken apart into component particles and made inert, stripped of any charge that had been added to it. While Zaraki could do the same, if he put all of his effort into it, he couldn't help but be envious by how easy Retsu made it look. After all, even for one like him who'd long since internalized him, the feeling of having come to terms with mortality and accepted the inevitability of one's own destruction was, by its nature, incredibly hard to weaponize. Getting to the point of using it at all, by not fearing death, was something he'd always been able to and which he fostered in his division, but that inner peace conflicted with his desire for combat. He was, after all, one of Soul Society's weapons, not yet the most deadly, but he would keep pushing until he got there. And while it was easy for a sword to accept its own inherent transience, that acceptance was still in a state of constant tension with the need to be used and bring the fight to the enemy. And he knew that Retsu had to feel the same. He could see it in the slowly growing smirk on her lips as her Ryotsu broke apart his own so easily just by mixing with it, so the fact she'd somehow managed to surpass that tension just made him all the more impressed with her sheer talent. It was what made him want so badly to become her match. Before Retsu's Ryotsu was even done breaking his own apart, he was charging, focusing on what it meant for a sword to pierce through an obstacle to strike true at its target, feeling it with every fiber of his being, and then making it become true, his closed fist striking with all of the speed and strength of an avalanche to match his own determination. It wasn't his best, not yet, not this early, but it was the kind of strike he could use to pierce through a steel wall twice as thick as himself and keep going afterwards. It was a strike that would kill almost anybody who was struck by it, and which most any opponent he'd fought who was even barely competent would almost certainly avoid. And then Retsu moved, with a quick and sudden strike of her own, carrying barely any of the power but much, much faster, and struck at his approaching fist with the index and middle finger of her hand extended, choosing to take the attack head-on. The sound of metal striking metal echoed through the endless chambers like a gong being struck, the sheer air pressure from the strength of the impact opening large cuts into the floor under them, and even scratching the faraway walls. And Zaraki's grin grew wider at seeing the way his fist had been blocked, Retsu's sheer skill and precision having allowed her to match their strike so she'd depleted all of his momentum, which, of course, was only possible because her fingers, just like his fist, had gained the property of a sword as they struck. After a heartbeat where they stayed like that, arms extended, two fingers stopping a closed fist, Retsu moved her fingers to the side slightly, the movement small but backed by just enough strength to force his arm to be redirected away from them, and the change in balance sent him stumbling forward while she took a single step to the side. He turned immediately, not wanting to let his back exposed to her for even a moment, even as his other hand drew his Zanpakuto from his belt. The old, battered thing was no more useful to him than any other part of his body, since he himself was more of a sword than the one he wielded, but the additional range could come in handy. Against an opponent like Retsu, any possible advantage that could be had should be chased. However, he found she wasn't pressing the attack. Zaraki frowned, trying to figure out if there was an angle, and Retsu seemed amused by it, as she folded her hands in front of her, her own Zanpakuto still sheathed. If you want me to take the initiative, you're gonna need to cause my blood to heat up a bit first. After all, as the more experienced partner in this little dance we're having, I am supposed to teach you, and how can I know what you need to learn if you don't show me first what you're capable of already? Her eyes glittered in challenge, and she added in an almost sing-song tone, "Don't make me wait too long," as her smile grew more threatening. Zaraki didn't let her tell him twice. As far as things would go, it wasn't completely surprising as a strategy for her to just wait and counter his attacks. It was possible that the fact she was supposedly teaching him was the reason she was letting him have the initiative, but it was just as possible she was just taking advantage of her superior skill by refusing to risk offering the opening that a botched attack could provide. Zaraki wasn't sure, but in truth, he didn't care. No matter that he agreed with it, the implied insult of treating him like he was no threat was enough to get his blood boiling, and he could use that to show Retsu that he was worth taking seriously. After all, he knew that she enjoyed fighting, and specifically, she knew that she'd enjoyed fighting him at least as much as he'd enjoyed fighting her since the first time they met. It was just a matter to make her remember why. With his goal clear in mind, he went for another strike, this time an overhead chop with his sword, but once again, Retsu moved faster than he did. This time, she parried instead of blocking, slapping the blade away with the back of her hand. Zaraki's grin widened, as he'd expected that, and his other arm was going for a straight thrush at her belly with a knife hand, but then the arm she'd parried with swung downward in a burst of strength that he wasn't sure how she'd achieved, since strength was a factor of the amount of Ryotsu deployed, and currently he had more of it unleashed than her. Yet that didn't change the fact that, by using his sword as leverage, her movement sent him spinning to the side, aborting his attack and sending him crashing into the ground, in a hit that would have broken all his wounds if he hadn't extended his focus on being a sword to his whole body, so that the floor was left damaged and cratered instead. Zaraki got back up easily, if a bit battered and with some light bleeding here and there, but as he turned to look at Retsu, she clucked her tongue and said, in a thoughtful tone, "Is it really worth having a longer reach if you then fail to account for the consequences of having it?" Size only matters if you know how to use it properly, otherwise it's just wasted. Zaraki considered those words for a moment before countering, his smile growing. If I tried to make do without, that'd be just as much of a mistake, isn't it? That caused Retsu to smile minutely, before she went on to say. Obviously, you're very good using just your hands, but I won't be satisfied if you limit yourself that way. Are you going to make this enjoyable at least, or will you continue to waste my time? I'm enjoying myself plenty already. Even as he shouted that, Zaraki went on the offensive again. He gripped his sword with two hands, swinging with as much strength as he could, each wild slash forcing Retsu to dodge backwards after each fight. She then pouted, saying, "You need to think of my own enjoyment as well, you know." As she went to move her arm into a parry on what, Zaraki knew, was the sloppiest of the attacks he'd launched at her so far, just as he'd expected. As his sword descended and her arm ascended to intercept it, he used a minimal flare of repulsive Hakuta around his eye to send the eye patch flying, which suddenly caused his Ryotsu to grow exponentially in quantity, and just as it did, he willed it to exert his pressure to keep Retsu still. He could see it as a tiny spark of genuine surprise in her eyes as she figured the meaning of the maneuver right as it happened. She knew what his plan was, and that she had no way to prevent it from happening. The sudden increase in his Ryotsu would multiply his strength to an extent that would make her block insufficient to stop his sword, which would cut through instead, and even as her own Ryotsu was seeping into his own to break it apart, it would take just an extra fraction of a second for it to take effect, and that amount of time would be too late to give her the chance to react properly. It wasn't much, he knew she could heal, but Zaraki had never managed to hit her outside of that one time, so finally being able to get a second hit would feel sweet, and he was anticipating it. Then, Retsu exhaled, and as her breath reached his face, it felt as if he was being ravaged by a multitude of sharpened iron shards that had been overheated nearly to the melting point. The pain of having his face scorched and scarred like that was enough for Zaraki to blink, slowing him down for the barest fraction of a second that his opponent needed to let her own Ryotsu surge to overpower his own, giving her back her reflexes so that she was able to dodge back his sword by the barest of margins. Zaraki stepped back in confusion, shaking his head until he had regained enough of his sense to see that Retsu stood there, one hand raised and covered in the blood that had to have fallen from his face when she'd cut him with just her breath. She had her threatening smirk again, as she said, in a mocking tone, "My, you really made a mess of my clothes, that's a bit sloppy, don't you think?" Before she flicked her hand in his direction. His eyes widened at that and he tried to roll out of the way, but while they were out of melee range, they were still too close and several of the droplets of blood hit straight on his shoulder and upper chest, each one carrying the same penetrating power as a sword and punching straight through him with enough strength that, in addition to leaving him bleeding on the ground, it smashed him into it strongly enough to leave a crater beneath it as well. As he moved back to his feet with a grunt of pain, Retsu's voice sounded sad as she said, "You know, I was so incredibly impressed in how you managed to turn your body into a weapon at first. It was such a brilliant idea, it really got my blood pumping to see such innovation come from one so young." Zaraki frowned. That didn't really make any sense to him. He still remembered that fight as clearly as if it happened a few days ago, instead of a few centuries. In his journey throughout Hueco Mundo, Zaraki had learned how to make his body into a weapon, as that had been the only way to survive the hollows he'd had to fight. He'd used that to survive with minimal food, since after all weapons didn't need to eat, but that hadn't been pleasant, so when he'd made it to the Rukanga, with plenty of food available, he hadn't hesitated to take it, since it wasn't like anybody was strong enough to stop him. Still, the fights had been so pitiful that he'd made a sport to steal it without being noticed, since that at least required him to put some effort into it, until he'd met Yachiroa, who was being left to starve and denied food because she couldn't afford that. He wasn't sure why that had angered him so much, but he knew that seizing the food cart so that she could eat to her heart's content had attracted a lot of attention, and she'd been so hungry that, by the time she was done eating her fill, a patrol of Shinigami from the 3rd Division had been there. Zaraki had never fought Shinigami before that, and it had been a very eye-opening experience, not only about how much he had to learn, but how much more fun they could be as opponents. While a few hollows he'd fought were stronger, most couldn't hold a candle to all the trickery Shinigami could get up to, and by the end of the fight, when he stood over the leader of the patrol who he'd just slain with the very Zanpakuto he still carried, which he'd pried out of her own hand during the battle, He'd known that he wanted more. Only having to ensure Yachiro didn't become collateral damage, since that would have wasted the effort he'd went to keep her from dying of starvation, had persuaded him not to stay and wait for more reinforcement, but from then on, he'd started to seek confrontation, while also taking the time to train Yachiro so she could keep herself out of his fights and let him enjoy the coming confrontations. And come they had. Slaughtering an entire patrol had put the 3rd Division of the time on his tail, and he'd had plenty of fighting. Of course, the fighters themselves had been as shitty as the 3rd Division always was. If anything, Zaraki was pretty sure those of his time had been a particularly bad batch, since the locals were willing to help him hide whenever he had to recover from wounds more than half the time. And eventually, whoever the moron who was captain of them at the time was, Zaraki hadn't bothered to learn the name, and the guy had been replaced for incompetence at some point or another, realized he couldn't handle the matter on his own, and asked the help of somebody who could actually fight. That was how he'd finally met Retsu. It had been a darker night than usual, and he still remembered how hard that fight had been, as he'd put up his strength, wildness, and ability to turn himself into a weapon, and been found lacking, even if he'd at least managed to land the one blow before being defeated. And then Retsu had spared his life, and argued to have him pay for his crimes by accepting military service in the 11th Division under her command instead, and getting him to agree with the promise of a stream of endless fights for him to enjoy himself with, until he was ready to face her again. A promise she'd maintained. But he also remembered how, in that very first fight, after he'd started using his power to its limit, Retsu had countered by showing she had the same ability, just as she'd doing this entire fight so far. So, Zaraki looked up at her with confusion before asking, perplexed. Why are you talking of innovation? You can do the same thing, you can do it better. But Retsu shook her head, letting out a long sigh as she countered, sounding wistful. Not at all, what I do is completely different, I merely adapted it to also copy what you did. It wasn't hard at all, once I'd thought of it, but I learned something new about myself that day. It made our fight memorable in a way I'd never imagined possible before. Her gaze then focused on him, and her voice suddenly took a harsher tone, almost like a rebuke. And the fact that you failed to realize that was what happened is what we are here to correct. You should have figured it out on your own, but then, you never paid attention to what the achievement that earned me the title of Grandmaster was, did you? Zaraki growled at that, and countered in an annoyed tone. Of course I know, you taught me to learn all I could about my opponents, and no opponent I've ever had was more in mind than you at any point. You're the one I aim to surpass. She raised an eyebrow at that, gesturing with one hand to encourage him to speak forward, and he added, even as a part of his focus was on slightly flexing her shoulder to see how much damage to it her attack had inflicted. I made myself into a weapon, but to you, everything is a weapon. Her lips curled upwards just a bit at that, even as she nodded slightly. That's a way to describe it, but not the one I use. I am the ultimate master swordswoman, anything can be turned into a sword in my hands. That's how I earned the title of Kenpeki. Her gaze focused in intensity, as she added, however, until meeting you, I didn't realize my very body could be considered a weapon, become another sword for me to wield. You helped me find my best weapon, and that's why I offered you the respect that none of the many other opponents I bested over the years ever received, and passed the title of Kenpeki down to you. A certain bloodthirsty eagerness entered her smile, and Zaraki found himself matching it with one of his own, as she went on. And wielding you was an incredible feeling, the sense of immense power in having a weapon at my side second only to myself. It was exhilarating, as long as it lasted. Her expression hardened then, and Zaraki grunted, getting a sense for where this was going that broke away some of his own excitement as well. But then it ended. Retsu nodded. It did, when I realized there was no more satisfaction to be had in simply telling you what to do, bound to follow my wishes and act to my pleasure, when it limited you so. You could be so much more, the only one who might possibly be my equal partner in a spar, if you could just see past you limitations. I thought letting you have your own command would push you in the right direction, and it helped somewhat, but it wasn't enough for you to break past your limits. Zaraki frowned. Sure, he wasn't as strong as Retsu yet, but he felt like he was getting stronger all the time. He'd learned a lot since becoming a Shinigami. And of course, the more time passed, the more Ryutsu he absorbed from his sword, which made him stronger, faster and capable of deploying a larger amount of Ryotsu to crush people under. So he countered. I don't have any limits, I just need to keep growing my power. Retsu's expression hardened. I am well aware that's what you think, however, you are wrong. This very way of thinking is what is holding you back, and that's why we are here, now. I'm going to drag everything you have out of you, until you are all that you can be, even if it kills you. The only answer Zaraki had to that was to grin widely, his bloodlust returning at the challenge, as he countered. Won't you be left without the opponent you dearly seek, if you kill me? Retsu scoffed, but there was a playful tone to it as she replied, Don't be silly, if I happen to kill you in the process of training you up, I'll just need to bring you back. Then she opened her arms wide, in an inviting motion, and shouted loudly now, if you think I'm wrong, and that you don't have any limits, come. Let's see who out of the two of us can last longer, show me your full might. Needing no more encouragement, Zaraki did. He was relentless, letting his Ryotsu fill him to maximize his power, using his ability to turn himself into a weapon to apply to individual fibers within his muscles so that his strength was increased by tireless muscles that couldn't break, sharpening his body so that air resistance didn't slow him down as much, turning his body into a tireless weapon so that fatigue was not a concern. Soon enough, he was moving faster than he had in decades, delivering hits too powerful that the ground was being cracked by the sheer air pressure they generated, to say nothing of the chasms that were opened whenever his blade actually struck them. And yet, for all that he was trying, Retsu continued to ignore his efforts with absolute nonchalance. Any attack with his sword she parried away with ease, using either the palm or the back of her hand to do so, while whenever he attempted to hit Het with physical blows such as punches, kicks, headbutts or shoulder checks, she just dodged out of the way. He wasn't sure how long that went on, as time lost its meaning throughout their training. It could have easily have been days, but Zaraki didn't know, and honestly, he didn't care. He lost himself in the rush, the sheer joy of facing an adversary so much above him incredible, the progress he was making in power just from the effort he was putting into it becoming clearer with every minute the fight continued pushing him forward ever more. He was sure that the moment he would be her equal was inching closer with every thrust of his sword, but to be honest, Zaraki almost didn't care anymore. He was having so much fun, he just didn't want to ever stop. Retsu, however, didn't seem to be enjoying herself yet, and that was the only thing Zaraki wasn't fully happy about. If anything, as the fight had been going on, she seemed to have become more and more annoyed, even if Zaraki couldn't figure out why. He was in the middle of charging at her again, when she suddenly took a firm step, her sandaled feet slapping onto the floor with a gentle but firm tap. This immediately caused a thin but deep crack to erupt along the ground from the point of impact and speed toward him in a straight line, quick and sharp like the cut of a razor, and it was all he could do to slam his foot on the ground in time to create a crater of broken stones that managed to stop the attack. But it also forced him to break his charge, as it had intended to, and he couldn't help but grin at Retsu as he asked, his tone teasing. Have my attacks become dangerous enough for you to finally start attacking me back? No, you're just proving denser than anticipated. I thought the lesson you had to learn was pretty obvious, but since you don't seem to realize what is the necessary next step you need to take to progress, I'm going to force it on you. Her lips parted lightly, revealing a grin that was halfway between mischievous and hungry, as she added, in a whisper meant to carry, that's how I like it best anyway. Then she straightened, taking an imperious pose, as she concluded, so, I'm going to keep you from getting any closer to me than you currently are, show me that you can figure out how to overcome that, because I'm growing bored of waiting. Zaraki immediately went to charge ahead, but Retsu waved an arm in front of her, in a motion that would normally have done nothing more than generate a bit of wind, except, when she did it, the wind slammed into him like 100 sharpened blades, and while he'd expected it and sharpened his skin to match the edge of a blade, the sheer amount of attacks was enough to push him back, and unlike most other people, Retsu's cuts were always sharper than any edge he could create, leaving a myriad of little cuts over his skin. She rebuffed his follow-up attempts of charging at her in an identical manner, so Zaraki decided to try a different approach. His fingers turned piercing like the tip of a blade as he slammed them into the stone floor, ripping as large a chunk of it as his steel muscles reinforced by his almost limitless Ryotsu could sustain and throwing it at Retsu, before immediately following up the maneuver by jumping after it, using the rock to hide himself. Retsu grinned, her expression threatening, as she shouted, "Good. Use your environment to your advantage, scrape for every advantage you can grab and throw it at me. Nothing less will be enough," and then reached for her shoulder, plucking what looked like two small lints from her clothes and throwing them forward, each flying straight as if they were hard blades. The first smashed into the piece of broken floor, the lint coming apart on impact for just a moment, spreading over the entire surface of the rock, before then immediately regaining its sharpness, in the process cutting it in so many pieces the remains crumbled into dust, while the other was aimed straight for the middle of Zaraki's chest. He could, he knew, just use his power to make his body into a blade, that would probably deflect the attack away with only minor cuts, but the sheer strength behind the throw would cause the impact to push him backwards, whereas what he wanted was to get closer to Retsu, so he could strike at her. So, he instead decided not to use the ability, letting the lint pierce all the way through his body, erupting out of his back with an enormous spurt of blood, while his flight continued forward uninterrupted. Zaraki landed on one knee, his free hand smashing into the ground with the power of a blade to anchor him for a moment, before immediately he moved to strike at Retsu, his sword heading for the very same point where he'd wounded her, but she was quicker, getting out of the blade's reach with a simple, almost lazy backwards hop. Zaraki wasn't surprised, indeed he'd expected that to fail, which was why his other hand clenched into a fist, ripping another piece of the floor off and throwing it at her, to which Retsu laughed, shouting, "That's the way, now keep coming. Harder. Harder and faster. Use everything you have, and more." Even as she batted the incoming projectile away with a backhand. But Zaraki could feel the excitement mounting in her as his Ryotsu surged and battled with hers, the relentless pressure he tried to exert being cut apart by her indomitable will even as he went to the attack again, his sword striking for Retsu's head. He'd expected her to dodge, or at least use her hair to deflect the attack or something. Instead, she inclined her head, the movement pulling the hair out of the way and exposing her throat so that his blade could reach it unimpeded in what, to Zaraki's absolute shock, should have been a perfect decapitation strike. He was absolutely lost for a moment, as he could not understand why she would leave herself open like that, at least until his blade struck and, instead of cutting through, stopped straight at her neck, the edge of the blade matched by one equally unyielding. She kept her head cocked like that for a moment, looking at him in silence before saying, in a pitiless tone of voice, "You should take better care of your weapons. If the edge of your sword is chipped and cracked, how can you expect it to be able to cut through anything at all?" That wasn't how things were meant to work. He could cut things with his head, which had no edge at all, and Retsu herself had just shredded a rock into dust by giving lint a cutting edge. The fact that his sword was falling apart shouldn't matter to his attacks at all. He wasn't sure what exactly Retsu was pulling here, but he didn't let that distract him, continuing to press his attack with a knee to her gut, or that had been his intention, but then Retsu drew her sword in a smooth motion, placing the cutting edge of it in the path of the piercing power that he'd added to his knee, and the latter gave up, split apart in the clash as if it was tissue paper. Zaraki stumbled back, grimacing at the pain when he tried to stay on his leg when the knee bone had been split straight open, but he was a weapon, and since weapons didn't feel pain, just reaching that state of mind pushed the feeling away, while turning his leg into a single long blade to support himself upon helped him stay standing. Retsu tut-tutated at him, a finger to her mouth while she kept her sword in a reverse grip in front of herself, and said, "See, that is what you have never learned. Yes, Zanjutsu lets you give a sharp cutting edge to the sword you use, because a sword has that property of sharpness inherent to it, and you just bring it forth. But the reason this only works on Zanpakuto is that the sword, itself, has to be aware of this property for it to be brought forward, or else it doesn't work. You could do it to your body because you yourself genuinely believe that you are a weapon, and as such, you can bring that part of it forward in a way other people couldn't. That's why they say it can't be taught. It's not a matter of mere emotion, it is a matter of who you are. You need a sense of true belief that cannot be faked, and cannot be learned, something one needs to find in themselves. Just like my ability to make anything into a sword comes from my absolute certainty that, given enough time, there is nothing I could not use to cut something apart, even paper can be used to split rock, with enough skill. The edge is already there, I just bring it forward." Retsu gently flipped the Zanpakuto in her hand to a proper grip, the blade catching the purple light in a way that made it look sinister and sharper than Zaraki thought it could be, as she went on, undeterred. "But the fact is, a Zanpakuto has a belief of his own. It knows, both instinctively and through experience, what it is capable of, and it can bring those properties forward by itself. As long as it knows that, a Zanpakuto can even increase its own sharpness without the user's help, but ultimately, a Zanpakuto and a Shinigami are at their best when they work together. She raised her gaze, from the position where it had been regarding the glinting edge of her sword, to fix itself on Zaraki's, and the sheer intensity of it pinned him in place for a moment. And Minagiki knows that nothing I have ever used it to cut was ever able to withstand her edge, just as she knows that anything wielded by my hand will cut through any opposition. When I wield Minagiki directly, we both know there can be nothing sharper, no obstacle able to withstand our edge. Then, Retsu pointed her sword towards Araki's own, and went on, her tone scolding. Your Zanpakuto, on the other hand? All it knows is that you only ever take power from it, making it weak to grow yourself stronger. It knows that its blade is chipped and broken, its edge frayed and unable to cut through anything unless you impose your will over it. It knows that you don't care to repair its damage, and that instead of treating it like your sharpest of limbs, you barely even consider it a part of yourself at all. Is it any surprise that such a broken weapon doesn't believe itself to have any edge worth speaking about? You can call forth true cutting power from such a broken tool. Zaraki growled at that, feeling genuinely annoyed for the first time in what had to have been weeks since this training had started. I don't need shortcuts like relying on tools to achieve my goals. I've made it this far relying only on myself, and I don't believe for a moment that you're so weak as to have done otherwise. It was insulting that she would even imply such a thing, and Zaraki's range mounted as Retsu frowned and countered, sounding almost sad for a moment. But don't you see? Nobody can make it alone. They might not help you in battle, but the people around you are the true source of your strength. Your division who gives you their devotion and admiration, Yachiru who believes in you with absolute trust, your seated officers that push you to keep yourself sharp with their desire to match themselves up against you, the whole of Soul Society that gave you something to protect and be strong for, even Genri Usai and the rest of his idiots for giving you restrictions to struggle and define yourself against, all of them have contributed to make you who you are today. They're as much the source of your strength as your desire to become my match is. Those are just incidental things on my path to growing stronger, I don't care about any of that at all. Zaraki roared his answer, his body shaking with fury, which grew even greater as Retsu's expression turned sad, almost pitying as she said, Softy. I know, but my point is, you should. That made him angry enough to launch himself forward, his fist cocked back, but before he had made half a step, Retsu's expression hardened as she said, Gorge on their flesh, Minagiki, and the sword in her hands transformed into a green, flying manta ray that was so large in size the transformation alone brought it over Zaraki before he could move any further. He was confused for the barest fraction of a moment necessary to remember that, despite how Retsu had used her Shikai in the last few decades, the manta's digestive acids weren't actually only capable of reconstructing something they're affected, that was just their power being applied in reverse, but when used normally, they instead instantly dissolved anything they touched completely, regardless of what it could be. And that micro-fraction of a second of hesitation was all that Minagiki needed to swallow all of Zaraki's left arm at the shoulder, before reverting back to its sword form, firmly held in Retsu's grasp. He easily kept himself painless, but the moment of sheer surprise from having been left with only the arm that was holding his sword was enough for Retsu to speak up, her tone inexorable. This is your proving ground, Zaraki, you're not walking away from this, until I either make you understand how much you're crippling yourself or am proved wrong. And the latter is not going to happen. Here, you either learn, or you die. She then took a step forward, swinging Minagiki as she did. Instinctively, he raised his own sword to block, but when the blade touched, a bare contact that only involved the very tips of both blades, Retsu's blade cut through his as if it wasn't even there, the edge biting into a point where his own blade was chipped and easily traveling through it all without even slowing down, sending the tip of his own sword, a small fragment barely as few centimeter in length, flying away into the distance. Retsu raised an eyebrow, and said in a mocking tone, Is that the best you can do? Before taking a new step forward, a very small one, and swinging her sword again, sending another short fragment of Zaraki's blade flying into the darkness. He grit his teeth, and focused his desire to cut on his blade, willing it to manifest a sharp cutting edge, and this time there was a small, Not very loud think. Sound of metal hitting metal when Minajiki struck, followed by another piece of his sword being sent flying into the darkness. Zaraki gathered back as much of his Ryutsu as he could, completely stopping any pressure at all from affecting his surrounding, to try and use it to augment his belief that the sword was sharp enough to stop Minajiki, applying it with as much strength and power as he was capable of. The following sound was a much louder clangor than before, and the movement of Retsu's swing was slowed down a small fraction, but that was all that his effort did, as another piece of his blade was sent flying into the distance while she mocked, "Half measures are a waste of effort, either put your all into it or give up," before taking another step forward. Zaraki tried to take a step back, but Minajiki immediately transformed again, ripping through his leg in the blink of an eye, causing him to collapse to the ground in surprise at the change in his balance. The manta circled around him for a moment, before biting down again and then retreating, leaving his leg back in place, and with his knee healed up as well, while Retsu said, waggling a finger back and forth, "No backing down now, you boasted of your prowess, now show me you can go all the way." And then, she took another small step forward and swung again, and Zaraki knew he had to make his choice now. He was fully aware of how the process of repairing and strengthening a Zanpakuto by filling it with Ryutsu worked. He'd seen plenty of his own subordinates do it, and was capable of using the ability, but he'd never done so, or ever even wanted to. After all, any Ryutsu that he wasted on his sword was Ryutsu that couldn't make him stronger, power he couldn't accumulate to push himself closer to the unstoppable adversary he wanted to match. Except she was here now, standing in front of him as inexorable as a force of nature, and telling him that if he wanted to be the same, if he wanted to turn himself from merely strong to truly terrifying, he had to let go of his hard-won strength and power, and give so much of it to somebody without any certainty he would benefit from doing so, only a vague hope that having their help would somehow make the insurmountable task he was faced with become possible. All he had to tell him this would work, the only guarantee, were the word of the one person he respected most in the world, and who, he knew, wanted him to succeed as much as he himself did. And that, he realized, was really more than enough of a guarantee for him to take the risk. Zaraki let the Ryutsu he constantly held tightly within himself go, filling his Zanpakuto with it, using it to fuel the sudden surge of repairs and strengthening he applied to it. It was more than just that, though. It was years, decades, even perhaps whole centuries worth of experiences, of countless fights against many opponent, of the fun of threading the life between victory and defeat time and time again, of the joy of enemies cowering in awe as he survived wound after wound the same way he'd cowered when he'd face a woman without name who let him stab her in the throat just so she could disarm him of his weapon, and the many ways in which that same weapon remained at his side, taking punishment and damage without ever actually wholly breaking until today, loyal despite how much he mistreated it. He felt it, as all that he had stolen flowed back into his Zanpakuto, granting it a personality that was its own and also not, as it had been part of his for so long. It was hard for him to recognize as a different individual, instead sensing it as almost a copy of himself. And Zaraki realized, in a sudden moment of inspiration that also made him feel like an idiot, that what he'd been doing had been given to his fear, a fear he didn't even realize he had, that he couldn't count on anybody or anything, when all the while, he had been keeping himself from recognizing a true brother, somebody who shared in his wishes and goal and wanted to see them truly realized, because they were his own. Scared of sharing what had never been meant to be hoarded, failing to recognize a potential ally just because their random circumstances had put him in a situation where he could call the shots. The realization was liberating. Now that it was bared to his eyes, Zaraki could see that fear for the weakness that he was, and as he cast it away, he could feel himself becoming stronger, his soul growing mightier even as his amount of Ryutsu diminished, siphoned away to give his Zanpakuto all the power it needed to be truly his equal. And with the fear gone, it was easy to let himself trust, firmly believe that his sword was just as strong as him, and together, they both were stronger, enough to block anything. Once again, the sound of metal striking metal echoed throughout the dark chambers, but this time, it was a much higher, keener sound, and as Zaraki's eyes recovered their focus, he saw that the sword in his hand had changed, the blade back to its full length, the steel a gray with deep blue waves along it all, the edge glinting silvery and holding strong against Minajiki, slight sparkles coming from the point where the two swords were meeting, somehow neither of them being damaged by the clash. He saw the excited light in Retsu's eyes and her manic grin, and knew they were matched by similar ones on his own face, Then she stepped back and went to spoke, but before she could he said, firm. You were right. I was crippling myself, by thinking that I was strong enough to make it alone. That caused her smile to take a smirk of amusement as she answered. Of course I was right, anything is a sword in my hands, and I know how to get the best out of any sword I am wielding. And I've wielded you for long enough to be well aware of what you needed to reach your full potential. Then, she motioned with Minajiki, pointing at the Zanpakuto in Zaraki's hand and asked, curious. So, you and your sword have finally found each other now, but have you learned its name, and is it willing to lend you its power? Zaraki was surprised by the question, but only for a moment. A barest thought was all he needed to reach his blade, and the moment he did, knowledge flooded him, as somebody who could be his own twin shared all that it could with him, its desire to help him best Retsu in return for helping it best Minajiki so stark and powerful, that even though the sensation was so alien, he recognized it immediately as his very own, as seen through a mirror made of steel. He looked up at Retsu, grin widening, and answered. Yes. Let me introduce you to my Shikai, Avenge, no Zarashi. The power he'd gifted to the blade exploded, and for the first time in his life, Zaraki felt the effect of being enveloped by a spiritual pressure strong enough to almost steal his breath away, before the power merged with his own, and while it was just exactly the same amount of Ryutsu he was able to unleash before when he was not wearing the eye patch and letting it blast free at full power, there was something exhilarating in the feeling of it being brought together in such a fashion. Of course, his sword also changed form, turning into something halfway between an axe and a meat cleaver, and it was huge, about the same size as he himself was, although Zaraki couldn't feel any difference in its balance. He saw Retsu's appreciative glance, and looking forward to impress her more, he motioned with his head to the arm that he was still missing due to Minajiki's previous attack, and said, you gave me this wound, didn't you? No, Zarashi thinks it's only fair if we return the favor. And just like that, Retsu's left arm was sent flying, ripped apart at the shoulder. Even though none of them had moved at all, her expression was one of absolute shock and surprise, as she glanced at the wound, before turning back to Zaraki's shit-eating grin, and erupting into laughter of her own. She recovered from it quickly, but her smile was still there, except filled with bloodlust, as she said. That's just like you, isn't it? I'm looking forward to put a skill like that to the full test of what it's capable of. It's going to be so much fun. Then, she waved, golden light enveloping the both of them, and a moment later, they were both completely healed, even their clothes returned to perfect condition, even as Retsu went on to say. After all, it's going to take of effort if we want to get you to Bankai, and we've lost long enough getting you to this point already, there's no more time to waste. Zaraki was surprised at that, and asked, finding that no Zarashi was just as curious as him. Isn't that supposed to be very difficult to achieve? For you, it won't be. The power comes from getting the soul of the Shinigami and of the Zanpakuto to reach the kind of perfect synchrony that only comes from knowing each other perfectly, and then finding a way to express that synchrony into a singular, unified manifestation of the combined will. However, she made a gesture to encompass him and his Zanpakuto both, have the first part down already, and as for the second, all that's required for that is a lot of experience fighting together. Normally, that means a lot of time, since even the most devoted of training can't provide more than a few hours a day of that, and in truth, most fighting helps very little, as only a true test with one's life on the line is going to really help with developing a true understanding. But, of course, our circumstance aren't normal. Retsu's Ryutsu started to seep the area, filled with bloodlust, as her grin took in hungry quality, and she concluded, her voice full of excitement. I'm going to wring out of you everything you have to give, and we'll keep going until your stamina gives out, and then push further. Now, let's get to it. And so, they did. In theory, Zaraki had known that, if they were going to be here for the equivalent of a few months outside the chamber, and every day was equal to a month inside, that he would be training almost non-stop for years, but knowing it proved itself different from actually living through it. They kept training uninterruptedly to exhaustion, and then, whenever they started to feel pain from lack of sleep or lack of food, Retsu would have a Kido ready to get their bodies past the hurdles and keep them going. She freely admitted that it was not healthy to rely on them and how it might cause them problems down the line that might require some months of complete bed rest once they were out of it, and they had a laugh at the idea that might be enough to stop either of them. And so, they spent their time training, pushing and seeing the very limits of what they could do. Zaraki hadn't thought his respect for Retsu's abilities as a fighter could possibly grow. That was another thing in which he was soon proven wrong. As simple of a power as Minazuki's transformation appeared to be at first glance, it didn't took long for Retsu to demonstrate the many ways the two of them could work together, and how hellishly difficult it was to truly withstand their combined attacks. He also gained a new appreciation for Retsu's Kido Grand Mastery, and how effective it could be in combat. Her unique ability to apply Kaido from range rather than needing to touch her targets might at first appear to just let her heal people at a distance, but there were a lot of Kaido that were actually incredibly debilitating effects normally unusable in combat due to requiring direct contact, and that was without considering how many healing technique could just as easily be turned to harm. Or how easy it seemed to be for Retsu to apply healing effects in reverse to have them inflict the very affliction they were otherwise meant to cure. They also explored all the limitations, possible applications, little quirks, and blind spots of his own Shikai, which Retsu being perfectly happy to both deliver and receive all sorts of wounds as needed to test them out. In fact, their fights eventually grew so brutal, as they grew more confident in the limit of what their combined abilities would allow them to survive inflicting on each other, that it almost felt like it was a fight between hollows, rather than Shinigami. And that was before Retsu was confident enough in his ability to survive it to pull out her own Bankai. Despite having done it himself, he had trouble believing he'd lived through its effects as many times as he had, but then, it wasn't like either of the two of them wanted to kill the other. In fact, Zaraki was starting to worry that no other opponent was ever going to give him a satisfying fight after what Retsu had just put him through, but despite that, he wasn't disappointed. Instead, he was almost eager to see what new excesses she would be able to push him into. The non-stop fighting was the most fun he'd had at any point he ever remembered, and while he knew that, in theory, this was mere training for the actual war they'd be heading into afterward, he had difficulty accepting it on an emotional level. Luckily, he was distracted from those thoughts once he finally managed to unlock his Bankai, after what had to be at least a few non-stop years of the most intense fighting he'd ever had the chance to enjoy. It turned out that it was, in fact, both possible for the combat to get even more intense, and for him to find a way to face a challenge that, if not equal to fighting Retsu, was at least similarly interesting, and perhaps even better at pushing him to surpass himself, as the two of them worked to find more ways to truly exploit its power. However, their training time came to an end before they could do much to truly measure the ability, as Zaraki barely had a couple of months to try it out before they were interrupted. It was just in the middle of a training session like any other. Zaraki was staring at the cloud of red mist in front of him, taking a measure of Retsu's precise position, before he waded into it, charging as fast as he could even as his skin and flesh melted right out of his bones, which themselves started to decompose before he passed the wound away and struck, only for his target to turn out to have been an illusionary Kido. Then his torso glowed with golden light and he collapsed to the ground. As his hearth exploded inside his chest, Retsu's voice echoing in a teasing tone as she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry about breaking your heart like that, let me collect the pieces and put them back together," before his chest glowed golden again as the spell was applied in reverse. He was back on his feet immediately, already jumping into the air even as he focused his senses, eyes looking at everything from multiple different angles, identifying two more illusions before locating the real Retsu, who raised a hand and said pause, to which Zaraki frowned as he asked, concerned, "What's the problem?" Retsu seemed to be listening to something else, before sighing, dismissing her Bankai as she did. "It seems our fun is at an end, we've been called upon, it's time to go teach young Sosuke a lesson." Zaraki dismissed his own Bankai as well, before asking, a certain eagerness his voice. "Is he attacking here?" Retsu shook her head, an amused smile on her face as she combed her hairs back into her braid, while saying, "Better." Apparently little Rukia found out where he set up his lair, anticipation clear in her every movement, an anticipation Zaraki couldn't help but share into. When her hairs were done, Retsu gestured at the door, which opened to reveal a Shinigami that had apparently been in the middle of knocking. He seemed to relax when he saw them as he started to say, "Captain Anohana, the Captain Commander wanted me to inform you." Before trailing off, as he caught sight of the state the room was into, and swallowed in sudden fear. That, Zaraki though, was probably understandable. Every single piece of both the floor and ceilings, as well as a good deal of the walls, had been broken, slashed, cut apart, thrown around and otherwise messed with to such an extent that it was difficult to locate anything in the room that didn't look like a ruin, and of course, almost every visible surface was covered in blood, much of it so thick it almost looked like paint. Retsu patted the Shinigami on the shoulder as she passed by, her Ryotsu brushing over him to force his body into a state of relaxation while she said, tone reassuring and matronly. No need to explain, I was able to hear what was going on outside a little bit. Feel free to go inform the Captain Commander that I and Captain Kenpeki are on our way. She waited until they were walking down a corridor on their own, the other Shinigami nowhere in sight, before asking him, in a relaxed tone. Do you feel ready for it? To anyone else, he wouldn't have even deigned to answer, but Retsu wasn't just anyone, so he admitted. I just feel like there's no way anything we might be heading into is going to be anywhere near as fun as what we just did, or help me grow any stronger. She looked at him with an amused expression. Forgetting your lesson already? Though I told you, while the fighting is fun and does help you get stronger, it's not the only thing that does. Everybody else in Soul Society that you care about is part of your strength. And we're going to be fighting for them. Does thinking about that helps at all? Surprising himself, Zaraki found that it did. So he smiled, knowing he wouldn't need to answer the question, as Retsu would see it in the way his shoulders straightened and his body started to thrum with anticipation. Zaraki Kenpeki was ready. Chapter 90, Start. Tatsuki looked at the set of burned metal husks in front of her, and frowned. While the heat from the fire had melted the metal just fine, none of the blue flames had remained attached to the metal like she'd wanted them to. She was pretty sure that she'd done it right, but the fire wasn't reacting to being infused with her emotions properly, almost as if it was rejecting her efforts to apply Hakuta to it. That's because that's exactly what's going on. I'm refusing to cooperate with you, and without my help, you can't use your little trick. Tatsuki couldn't help the spark of anger she felt at her inner hollow's disparaging tone, and channeled it into her Ryotsu as she punched out a fireball that invested one of the scraps of metals, turning it to ashes with the sheer heat of the empowered fire. Then she said out loud, even if the hollow would have been able to pick the words from her mind. See? I can totally add emotions to your fire, without my anger making it hotter. The fire was only able to melt the metal, whereas once I add it, it can turn anything to ashes. The tone of the hollow's answer in her head was dismissive. That's only because you're a small little ball of pent-up rage waiting to go off. You have no ability to control yourself, and fear what will happen if you go all out. Tatsuki scoffed. As usual, her inner hollow was being ridiculous. She went all out every time she fought, and didn't fear at all to pull out all the stops to achieve her goals. She could concede, however, that there was some truth to the hollow's other accusation. It was a fact that she had been so bad at controlling herself that she'd almost killed herself a few times. But that had only been until Hiyori had taught her how to focus that destructiveness. Now, she was perfectly capable of controlling herself. You're not. That arrogant little kid only taught you how to fear yourself, which just compound on the already present fear of letting your potential loose. Tatsuki turned to collect a few of the hunks of metal, piling two pieces on top of one another, before sending a thin burst of flame between them, trying once again to fill it with affection so it would gain a sticky quality. Even as she did, she countered the hollow's criticism by pointing out that not only had Hiyori taught her a number of things that had made Tatsuki stronger, they'd also been able to capture her inner hollow in the first place, which she was sure was the actual reason the hollow was demeaning the Visored. Her inner hollow's reaction to that accusation was to invest Tatsuki with so much annoyance it almost made her stumble, before saying, they were only ever able to do that because they had the Hujioku. But I won't deny I dislike them all, and the fact you would even take lessons from the one who can't even access her hollow's full power is just another reason I find your cooperation with them so annoying. Tatsuki didn't bother pointing out that Hiyori's hollows was much more difficult to control, instead moving to check on the two pieces of metal, pushing the one on the top very gently to see if the fire had worked, only to be annoyed when it fell down, proving the fire had not applied the sticky effect she'd tried to add to it. She clucked her tongue, trying to think of what it was she was doing different with her anger that was working despite the interference, but before she could figure it out, the inner hollow spoke up, apparently offended by the way she'd dismissed it as less troublesome than Hiyori's. I think you've been taking my cooperation for granted. If I wanted to, I could make it so that every time you call on my full power, everything around you gets set on fire immediately. Especially you allies. Would you still say that I'm easy to control then? Tatsuki ignored the comment, instead focusing her emotions, in one going for anger and in the other determination, and then delivering a quick 1-2 punch sequence, with each sending out a large fireball. The one charged with anger incinerated its target, but the other one, which should have used the weight of stone to punch through the wall, instead just left a scorch mark on it. Tatsuki sighed, especially when she felt the sense of smug satisfaction from the hollow, and so she asked, once again speaking out loud, more to acknowledge to herself that she was doing it than anything else. Alright, what do you want to stop being an annoying pain in the ass and let me use my full powers? Much as it was annoying to have to give in to the hollow, the fact was that Tatsuki didn't want to go into battle without full access to all of her abilities. It might cause somebody's death, and she couldn't risk some of her allies dying just because she wasn't willing to swallow her pride. See, that's exactly the wrong attitude, and what I want you to stop. You do not take pride in having the power of as great an hollow as myself at your command, and despite how it's the key to winning fights, you never even attempt to inspire fear into your opponents. I have tolerated such a subpar performance far too long already, and have no interest in doing so any further. Tatsuki was left confused by that tirade, since the hollow hadn't really expressed any such desire before. Yes, it seemed to be obsessed with fear in general, but this seemed a bit weird even when taking that into account. She wasn't even sure if she would want to go along with the request, but considering she had no idea how to go about it, Tatsuki shook her head, and simply decided to let it go. If she wasn't going to be able to use her full visored powers, she would be a liability accompanying Hiyori into Aizen's base, and risking her mentor's death by insisting to accompany her when she knew she couldn't fight at her best wasn't something she was willing to do. Wait, you're giving up, just like that? You're not even going to try and prove me wrong? Tatsuki ignored the inner hollow's surprised comment, as well as the disappointment the creature was sending through their connection. She was done playing games with the thing. Until it started to actually be direct with her and actually explain what it wanted, Tatsuki wasn't going to dignify it with any attention. The hollow didn't seem to have any comment to give in reaction to that thought. It didn't take long for Tatsuki to find Hiyori, and she couldn't help the small smile at seeing that she was practicing attacks with her sword. Apparently, releasing the tension before a big mission by training was another thing she and her master had in common. Still, she needed to notify her of the change in plans. So she coughed, causing Hiyori to turn in her direction, and then stopping her exercise routine. She stood Kubikuri Orokai at her side, leaning on the sword's large blade, waving with her other hand in greeting. Tatsuki. I was just getting in the right mindset for our mission. What of you? Feeling ready? Actually, I was thinking it would be better if I remained here, rather than coming along with you. Hiyori frowned at that. How comes? You were very insistent that you should come along, and I think I agree with your argument that, since your hollow is the most powerful after mine, it would give us more combat power concentrated where we need it most. Did you change your mind about that? She shook her head. No, actually the opposite. On one hand, I began to think that splitting the power more equally, like you initially suggested, might be a smarter play. But also, Tatsuki trailed off, uncertain for a moment, but then decided to just be honest and explained, with a sigh, also, I'm having trouble controlling my inner hollow. I'm worried that, if I lose control of it while we're in enemy territory, I might put you in danger, while if it happens here, the others might be able to help me contain it better. Hiyori seemed to consider that, before conceding, in a thoughtful tone. That's a fair point, I suppose. I just thought you were confident you could control it though. Tatsuki grimaced. I thought so as well, but I can't seem to channel its full power right now, and according to the hollow, it's because I can't force its cooperation. And, when I fought Kenpeki, I lost control of the hollow for just a brief moment, but that was enough for me to lose the fight. She saw Hiyori opening her mouth at that, and hurried to comment, yes, I know, I probably wouldn't have won anyway, but you can see why I wouldn't want to risk it when it might put you in danger, right? Hiyori's expression turned serious, and then she nodded. I understand very well. Then, to Tatsuki's surprise, her master moved forward, placing a hand on her shoulder and squeezing it in an encouraging manner. She looked her straight in her eyes and said, sounding proud. It's good that you are able to recognize your difficulties, and take actions to deal with them. That caused her to chuckle, and comment, I'm surprised, I expected you to berate me for being defeatist or something. Hiyori raised an eyebrow at that. Are you saying that you've resigned yourself never to overcome this block? What? No. I just don't know how to get around to it right now, and don't want to put you or the plan at risk because of that. Her master answered to the outrage in Tatsuki's voice with a grin, patting her shoulder again and saying, clearly approving. Then why should I be angry at you? You aren't giving up, you're just recognizing that you aren't yet strong enough to win, and you need to train before you can. I'm doing exactly the same thing to deal with my own hollow. It would be pretty hypocritical to criticize you for that, don't you think? Tatsuki didn't know how to answer to that, so she quickly pushed forward, reaching for the pouch at her belt that was filled with the negation devices, handing it over while saying, in a careful tone. Are you sure you'll be able to scatter them without being noticed? When you activate one, all the others will activate at the same time, and if they're all in the same area, you risk being surrounded instead of being able to have our reinforcements attack the enemies from the rear. Don't worry, it won't be difficult, so long as I have somebody there to help. Who were you thinking would be the best person for that, by the way? On this, Tatsuki didn't hesitate, the answer was, after all, obvious. Mashiro. If I'm staying away because I've the worst control of my hollow, then it only makes sense to send the Visored with the best control of their own, right? I guess, if nothing else, she'll be happy to be there to save Shinji. Then, Hiyori grinned. So, when are you going to tell her? Tatsuki was left stunned for a moment, but then smiled back and said, as she straightened. Right now, I think. Then she paused, pulling out the scarf on which she'd sewn the communicator Rukia had given her, handing it over to Hiyori while adding, you'll want this as well, to keep Rukia updated on what's going down and let her know when to strike. Hiyori nodded, taking the scarf, and with that done, Tatsuki headed for Mashiro. As she went, her inner hollow seemed to have found back its ability to be bothersome, as it said, in a smug tone. In any case, I'm much more satisfied with you going down this path. I haven't forgotten that it was that damn Hirako to capture me with the Hujioku in the first place, it's only right that I don't take part in any attempt to save him. Once again, Tatsuki ignored the comment, instead focusing on her sense until she located Mashiro, and headed in her direction. The green-haired Visored was reading, but she stopped upon noticing Tatsuki, and her expression turned into an annoyed frown as she did. She snapped her book shut, and then pointed it at Tatsuki before saying, in a warning tone. If you're here to once again try and goad me into a fight, you might as well leave directly without bothering. I have no interest in anything of the sort, and nothing to prove to anyone. Tatsuki let out a long breath, then shook her head. I'm not here for anything of the sort. I and Hiyori were speaking, and we agreed that it would work better if it were you to accompany her to Las Noches, rather than me. Mashiro looked genuinely taken aback at that, and when she asked why, she was clearly failing to figure a possible reason for her own. Tatsuki found answering her easy, almost like getting rid of a heavy weight on her chest. Many reasons, really. But the big one is that I worry about the chance of losing control of my hollow. We know you wouldn't lose control like that, which makes you better suited to have Hiyori's back. You are recognizing the possibility your presence might be a liability. It really seemed like the other Visored couldn't believe she would ever do that. It was a bit annoying, but Tatsuki pushed the feeling away, admitting to herself that she'd sort of earned the other girl's distrust. So she explained, in a peaceful tone. I know I gave you no reason to believe it, but I'm actually not an idiot. I know I can be reckless at times, hells, I fear I might end up doing something reckless that might put the whole mission in danger even if I stay here. But at least here there isn't a chance Aizen might use the Hujioku on me to take advantage of anything stupid I might do, and we both know you wouldn't be reckless. And you're willingly admitting it? Just like that. Tatsuki nodded. Just like that. I can think of many things I've done wrong in the past, I can admit my mistakes. I just also know that not everything I've done was wrong, and also that I'm working to get better at it. Can you believe that, at least? That I'm trying to get better. The other girl crossed her arms, tapping her book against her side, and answered in a thoughtful tone. I don't know. I don't think you're lying, but intentions are only half of what's needed, you know? Intentions without actions to back them up are meaningless, and mustering the will to act takes more than just recognizing the need for it. It takes a willingness to change that is difficult to achieve. That was a fair point, and Tatsuki wasn't sure how to answer that, so she decided to change tacks instead, remembering what Hiyori had said, so she smirked and said, in a playful tone. Surely, letting you be one of the two who'll be rescuing your captain is a nice enough gift to earn me a bit of leeway. Mashiro smiled softly at that, but before she could answer, Bernice entered the room, looking tense, and said, her breath short. They're here. Tatsuki's expression turned serious at that, and Mashiro did the same, setting her book down and following her into the larger central area of the warehouse where they were staying. As expected, Ulquiorra was there, with his expressionless face and emotionless gaze taking them all in, and next to him was a much taller and thin Aaron Carr, with dark skin, black hair tied up in a ponytail that ended in a waterfall of a dozen tiny braid, and otherwise a very human head, except for the band of bone that covered his eyes like a visor, sporting glowing red eyes within deep and dark eye sockets, with small holes underneath them and a tattoo with the number 9 above where the right eyebrow would have been, had the bone visor not been there. Tatsuki recognized the portion of the mask on the creature's face, and her inner hollow did as well as it said, in an amused tone. I remember that one, it's the hollow who tried to devour me back when I had taken you over before your friend Ichigo butted in. If we're going to be fighting that one, staying here is going to be even more rewarding than I expected it would. Tatsuki sighed, then said to the rest of the visored. I think that's the shapeshifter, he matches the look I remembered him to have. Ulquiorra seemed to take that as reason enough to speak up, in his usual empty voice. As agreed, Eren Nero is here, for you to keep under watch while you verify Hirako Shinji's health. Who should I bring along with me, and who will be staying? Not so fast. Ulquiorra turned to Hachigen, and the man said, his tone serious. We need to verify he didn't left any copies anywhere else. I can cast a Kaido on him that will react to what he says. It has no power to compel him, and it's easily broken, but it's capable of detecting if he's lying, and will signal it to us. Let me put them on him and ask the one question of whether he has other around anywhere else, so that we know you're not trying to trick us. Ulquiorra glanced at Eren Nero, who merely shrugged, before turning back to Hachigen and saying, emotionless as always. Proceed. However, when Hachigen was close enough, Ulquiorra also placed a finger on the visored's neck, causing him to suddenly go still with fear, and the Espada added, in the same tone. You will ask only that one question and no others, and then remove the Kido immediately, or I will behead you. Hachigen nodded slowly, and then placed a hand on Eren Nero's forehead, making him glow golden for a moment before asking. Is there any copy of you that isn't currently in this room with us? The Eren Carr scoffed, and answered, curt. No. I can only create copies when I'm in my fully released state, not in my current sealed one. Hachigen nodded, confirming to the others that Eren Nero wasn't lying, and then Hiyori stepped forward, Mashiro quickly moving to her side but one step behind, and said in a serious tone. The two of us will be the ones coming with you to Las Noches, Ulquiorra. Let's go. Tatsuki noted that, as she spoke, Hiyori had been fiddling with the scarf, which meant she'd activated the communicator, sending the message to Rukia so she would know to mobilize. Thus, even as she watched Ulquiorra open a rip in the air and motioning for Hiyori and Mashiro to follow him inside it, Tatsuki didn't falter, because she knew that, with this, the final battle against Aizen had truly began. Check the description for the links to the author.